Chapter 771. Meg had used his flying sword to protect the beauty in front of him, slicing through the saber with a single strike, slicing through the tree spear with a single strike, and sending Cade flying with a single strike. In a battle between powerful beings, time seemed to have lengthened, but in reality, all of this had only taken place in the blink of an eye. Cade crashed to the ground over 10 meters away, and his chest had caved in as if it had been struck by a sledgehammer. He lay sprawled on the ground with blood gushing out of his mouth, and his aura was gradually fading away. The forest troll withdrew its tree branch, and its entire body was stained with green blood. Even one of its arms had been severed, and it was howling in agony. Gajiel released his grip on the hilt of his saber and hurtled back in retreat, trying to get as far away from Meg as possible. He was Alex. His sword was the Tian-Du sword, and Alex was the only person in this world who could wield a heavy sword in such an intricate and unpredictable manner. He had seen that sword technique countless times in his nightmares. 5 years ago, when he had first met Alex, he had surrendered after taking a single sword strike. The last time he had seen him was 3 years ago, and he had almost been killed by Alex's sword strike. On this occasion, he was still unable to take a single sword strike from Alex. Why are you still alive? Why can you still return to your peak condition? This is impossible. Impossible. Are you a demon? Gajiel retreated with a horrified expression, and his mental state was already on the brink of collapse. They had made all the necessary preparations to kill Irina, and all of the 10th-tier powerful beings in Rodu were being monitored. However, no one had thought that Alex would appear, let alone Alex in his peak condition. I'm in a hurry. Meg glanced at the countdown timer, which was already halfway over, and spoke in a cold voice. He took a step forward and instantly brushed past Gajiel as he slashed his sword through the air, leaving a thin white line in its wake. Golden flames erupted from Gajiel's eyes, and his black shield had already appeared in his hand. He raised his hand to shield himself, but his porcupine-like body swelled drastically again, and a layer of hardened black skin had even appeared over his body. The thin white line continued to extend, cutting through the drops of rain. Like a paintbrush, it gently brushed past the black shield and then across his neck. A clean cut appeared on the shield that had been refined from the shell of a 9th-grade magic beast. Half of the turtle shell slowly fell to the ground, and a thin line of blood appeared on Gajiel's neck. His massive head flew high into the air, and blood gushed forth like a fountain. The rigid headless corpse slowly fell to the ground, and the massive head rolled a few times on the ground, staining the ground red with blood. The white line continued to extend forward, and lightly stabbed the vampire who was still struggling in the pool of blood. Devil! You must be a devil! Cade and Gajiel were killed in the blink of an eye. The forest troll who had lost an arm had already collapsed. Magic barriers of various sizes rose up around his body, and a dark green teleportation array appeared beneath his feet. The teleportation array had already been activated. Since you're here, don't leave. Meg raised his sword and walked towards the forest trolls. His expression was as calm as ever, as if he had just killed a few ants. Don't kill me. Don't kill me. Ah! The forest troll's face was filled with shock and horror. He made a series of hand seals with his remaining hand, and stomped his foot in an attempt to activate the teleportation array. Alex, I didn't think you'd still be alive. Right at this moment, a distant voice sounded from the void. A rift appeared in the sky, and 4 sticky tentacles reached out from the rift, then tore the rift apart. A giant octopus over 20 meters tall with countless tentacles squeezed out from the rift. What was even more terrifying was that there were countless eyes on the body and tentacles of the giant octopus, and each of the black and white eyeballs seemed to be glaring at you. On the head of the giant octopus stood a short and fat old man who looked like a dwarf. His feet seemed to have sunk into the octopus's body, and his ball-like body seemed to have fused with the octopus. The black and white eyeballs protruded from their sockets, making his bald head appear rather frightening. As soon as he finished speaking, two tentacles extended at a rapid rate, intertwining as they rushed toward Meg in an attempt to bind him. Joshua's griffin flapped its wings and quickly flew forward. He could already faintly hear the sounds of battle from the 5th Street, and that made him very excited. As long as there were sounds of battle, it meant that the battle was not over, and the arena was still alive. Even though he was extremely furious that the various races had tried to kill Irina behind his back, if he could take advantage of this opportunity to save the damsel in distress, perhaps it would be a good opportunity for Irina to throw herself into his arms. With that in mind, Joshua's expression became rather excited, and even the wand in his hand was trembling slightly. As the second prince of the empire, being able to become a 7th-tier magic caster at such a young age was already a testament to his exceptional talent. That was also the reason why he was favored and supported by the Magus Tower. Exceptional prodigies like Irina were still very rare. Be careful, Your Highness. There are violent spatial magic waves up ahead, and they've already exceeded that of normal 10th-tier magic casters. It's most likely the patriarch of the spatial demon race. Just as Joshua was fantasizing about saving Irina and emerging from a pool of blood with her in his arms like a hero, a massive white falcon quickly caught up to him, and a white-haired magic caster on the falcon's back spoke with a grave expression. What? Joshua's heart jolted upon hearing that, and even his griffin slowed down significantly as he looked toward the 5th Street with a bewildered expression. If this was a normal 10th-tier opponent, this great magic caster who was protecting him should be able to take care of him. In Rodu, they wouldn't dare to do anything to him, the second prince. However, if this was a patriarch of the spatial demon race, then he would most likely be far more powerful than a normal 10th-tier demon. This great magic caster from the Magus Tower most likely wouldn't be able to defeat him. There's a contract between all races that prohibits patriarch-level beings from appearing in the territories of other races. How dare he violate the contract in public? Is he not afraid that the Roth Empire will come after him? Joshua clenched his fists tightly. The magic caster wore a concerned expression as he said, Your Highness, the demons most likely won't give up until they achieve their goal this time. The patriarch of the spatial demon race has appeared in Rodu, and he's attacking the elven princess, so that's a direct confrontation with the elven race and the human race. If you go there now, perhaps he'll take the risk and attack you. Please reconsider your decision, Your Highness. Joshua looked in the direction of the 5th Street with a hesitant look on his face. Worry filled his eyes, but the griffin beneath him immediately slowed down. Chapter 772. There was a precipitous grayish-white stone mountain around 5 kilometers west of Rodu. This area was rich in stone, and it was said that the city of Rodu had been built from the stones dug up here to construct its tall city walls. There was also a legend surrounding this lone stone mountain. It was said that when the craftsmen dug up this mountain, the stones suddenly became extremely hard, and even the most resolute iron tools were unable to budge this mountain. This incident alerted the king of the Roth Empire, and he issued a special order to preserve this mountain, which was why it was known as the Amnesty Mountain. Due to the fact that the mountain was completely bare, and there were no beasts in the surrounding area, even birds were quite rare on this mountain, let alone magic beasts. There was an inky black cave near the summit of the mountain. The entrance of the cave was slightly slanted, so it was almost impossible to see the entrance from the foot of the mountain. Of course, there wasn't even a single blade of grass growing in a place like this, so no one would risk their lives to climb it. The torrential rain was washing away at the grayish-white mountain rocks, but even the craftsmen couldn't do anything about them, so they naturally wouldn't be washed away by the rain. The only sound that could be heard was the pitter-patter of raindrops falling onto the stone walls, and not even the cries of birds or beasts could be heard. Right at this moment, 2 streaks of purple light suddenly lit up within the inky black cave, illuminating the outside of the cave like 2 bolts of lightning. A bolt of lightning flashed past, illuminating half of the sky and illuminating the inky black cave. A gargantuan creature slowly rose to its feet, and it flapped its retracted wings slightly, sending dirt and gravel tumbling all over the ground. The gargantuan creature slowly made its way toward the entrance of the cave, and the two streaks of purple light also became brighter and brighter, as if they were two lamps. The black figure stood at the entrance of the cave, and it cast its gaze toward Rodu as it let loose a low roar. Another bolt of lightning flashed past. On this occasion, the gargantuan creature standing at the entrance of the cave finally revealed its true form. It was a massive griffin. Its body was covered in dust, and it looked as if it had just rolled through mud. It was very difficult to imagine how such a gargantuan creature with a wingspan of over 10 meters had been able to fit into such a cramped cave. Even so, it was still giving off an intimidating aura as it stood at the entrance of the cave with its wings curled up. Awoo! The lion condor suddenly raised its head and let out a resonant roar. Purple light burst out from its eyes like two bright stars, especially dazzling. The griffin's curled wings spread open with a snap, accompanied by the crisp sound of bones cracking. With a flap of its wings, the violent rainstorm was pushed back, piercing into the curtain of rain like a sharp sword. The dust was washed away by the storm, revealing the dazzling purple scales and wings. Even in the darkness, there was still light flowing around. The huge purple lion head looked quite majestic, but in between its eyebrows, there was a conspicuous black scar. With every flap of its wings, it would appear several hundred meters away, flying rapidly toward Rodu like a dark night specter. Over there was an aura that he was extremely familiar with. In order to wait for him, it had been lying dormant here for 3 years. Finally, he appeared again. After pulling his sword out of the forest troll's glabella, Meg kicked off the troll's shoulder and slashed his sword toward the two octopus legs that were hurtling toward him. The sharp blade of his sword sliced through the two octopus legs as easily as slicing through tofu. The legs fell to the ground with a thud, but they were still bouncing around with their eyes blinking in a frenzy, as if they were unwilling to die just like that. Meanwhile, the giant octopus didn't seem to have been affected in the slightest. Its flesh squirmed violently, and in the blink of an eye, two identical octopus legs grew out again. A series of eyeball-like pink lumps of flesh appeared on its legs, but they hadn't become actual eyeballs yet. Meg's expression was a little grim. This giant octopus that even a non-trypophobic person like him was feeling a little uncomfortable wasn't a real octopus. Instead, it was a type of heavenly void beast known as the eye beast. This type of heavenly void beast only existed in the void. Its body was massive, and it had an extremely freakish regenerative ability. If it couldn't be slain with a single strike, it was virtually immortal. The most terrifying thing about the eye beast wasn't its regenerative ability. Instead, it was the tens of thousands of eyeballs on its body. No creature would be able to remain calm when being stared at by so many eyeballs at the same time. In the instant that they lost their composure, they would be controlled by the eye beast and become its slave. Even in the heavenly void demon race, there were very few people who could find eye beasts in the void and tame them as mounts or helpers. Eye beasts of this size were no weaker than normal 10th tier powerful beings. Furthermore, due to their freakish regenerative ability and the fact that they could take advantage of a situation at any time, they were even more troublesome to deal with. As for why Meg knew so much about them, that was because Alex had just so happened to have killed an eye beast in the past, and he had also crippled that spatial demon in passing. If Meg's deduction was correct, then that 9th tier spatial demon was most likely the son of this spatial demon known as the spatial demon patriarch. Meg had the experience of killing the eye beast, and Meg also had the power to reach the pinnacle, but, you don't have much time left, so keep it up, host. The system's urgent voice sounded in Meg's mind, and Meg could even see a small red light flashing on his chest. System, do you think Ultraman is fighting monsters? Why don't you give me an Ultraman beam? Meg rolled his eyes, but he knew that he didn't have much time left. However, this beast and the spatial demon patriarch on its head were far more troublesome to deal with than those guys from before. There weren't that many 10th-tier powerful beings on the Norland continent, but there were still around 100 of them. Among them, there was naturally a huge disparity in power. Gajiel and the other 10th-tier beings who had attacked Irina earlier could only be considered as normal 10th-tier beings. However, people like Crassus, Julian, and the spatial demon patriarch on the beast's head could easily defeat normal 10th-tier beings, so they were on a completely different level altogether. Alex was naturally one of the most powerful beings among these beings, and he didn't fear any of them in a one-on-one battle. However, there was virtually no chance that Meg would be able to defeat the spatial demon patriarch and the beast within 3 minutes. This was because there was a good chance that he wouldn't be able to touch the beast during those 3 minutes. No matter how powerful he was still standing on the ground. In contrast, the beast could even tear through space to teleport in the air. Time passed by second after second, and even though Meg's expression remained calm and collected, his heart was thumping faster and faster. He stared intently at the beast with a sharp gaze. If it left the ground, then he would only have one chance to kill it. If he couldn't kill it, then he wouldn't be able to return alive. Alex, where's your little purple bird? The spatial demon patriarch looked down at Meg with a sinister smile on his face, and said, "Without it, you're nothing more than a bug on the ground. You crippled my son, so I'm going to let you have a taste of what it's like to watch Irina get humiliated." A series of octopus legs that were several tens of meters in length surged toward Meg and Irina, and their dead fish eyes blinked in a frenzy as if they were demons that had just caught the scent of food. Chapter 773. Your Highness, Alex and the spatial patriarch have appeared, and things have spiraled out of our control. Should we activate the emergency plan? In the dimly lit attic, Quinn stood behind Xiaoan and said with a nervous expression. Father will definitely be alerted by this. The forces we can mobilize are no match for Alex, nor are we able to defeat the spatial patriarch. Sean was silent for a long while before shaking his head with a cold smile on his face. Besides, Josh should be even more nervous than I am. Your Highness, our scouts have reported that Alex has appeared. Josh was hovering in mid-air atop his griffin, and he didn't dare to approach the spatial patriarch. A black-robed man quickly rushed over with a horrified expression. What? Josh's body swayed, and he almost fell off his griffin as an incredulous look appeared in his eyes. The black-robed man's face was also filled with shock and horror, but he still quickly explained, the one battling the spatial patriarch is Alex, and he has appeared. Josh's expression darkened drastically as he shook his head with incredulity. How could he still be battling the spatial patriarch? That's impossible. He's already a piece of trash who can't even walk. The magic caster beside Josh also turned deathly pale as he murmured to himself in a horrified manner, Alex. Alex is still alive. If he can battle the spatial patriarch, then he must have already returned to his peak. He's already killed 3 10th-tier powerful beings, and all of them were insta-killed. The black-robed man's voice was a little hoarse, and even the torrential downpour couldn't make his throat moist as he had swallowed countless mouthfuls of saliva as he spoke. Let them charge over and rescue Princess Irina. As for the rest, kill them all. Alex is already dead, and Alex no longer exists in this world. Josh took a deep breath as he waved a hand through the air with a cold expression. The black-robed man looked up at Josh with incredulity, and a hint of horror immediately welled up in his heart at the sight of Josh's frosty expression. Yes, Your Highness. The group of black-clad steeds stopped in the rain and charged toward the 5th Street once again. They didn't know what kind of opponent they were going to face this time, as they only needed to follow the second prince's orders. Your Highness, for your own safety, you should retreat to a safe place. Alex, he. The old mage looked at Joshua and hesitated. As Joshua's most trusted subordinate, he was naturally involved in the incident back then. Although he also didn't know how Alex had survived and returned to his peak, the image of the black sword and the terrifying man who had cut through level 10 like chopping vegetables was still deeply imprinted in his mind. He had been awakened by nightmares countless times in the past 3 years. But now, this man had appeared again and was even able to fight against the Void Ancestor. This fear caused his body to tremble uncontrollably. Josh's expression gradually calmed down, and he shook his head as he looked in the direction of the 5th Street. No, I'm going to watch him die tonight. If he doesn't die, then all of us will. The Void Ancestor's chubby face was filled with wrinkles, and his hideous smile had all twisted together like a pile of rotten meat. His eyes were glowing with red light as he looked at the countless octopus tentacles hurtling toward Meg and Irina. It was as if he could already see Irina being ravaged by the tentacles while Alex could only look on in agony. His favorite son had tamed the eye beast when he was just 500 years old, and he possessed exceptional aptitude. However, Alex had killed the eye beast 5 years ago, crippling his demonic spirit, and forcing him to commit suicide by entering the spatial turbulence. He had always engraved this grudge in his heart. 3 years ago, Alex had been crippled, and news of his suicide had spread. Everything had gone according to his plan, and he had thought that everything had come to an end. However, who would have thought that Alex would still be alive and return to his peak? My son is dead, so why are you still alive? You should all be buried with him. The Void Ancestor wore a deranged expression as one octopus tentacle after another surged toward Meg, as if it were trying to completely bury them. Meg stood in front of Irina with his long sword drawn and a grim expression on his face. 3 years ago, Alex had been carrying Amy on his back, and he had been crippled. However, on this occasion, Irina was standing behind him, and there were only 30 seconds left before he would be completely exhausted. There was no second chance, and he definitely couldn't allow Amy to lose both her father and mother in one night, so he was prepared to fight with his life on the line. Howl! Right at this moment, a loud roar suddenly rang out in the distance, and a purple figure appeared in the air like a wraith-like spirit before hurtling down like a sharp arrow. Ozzy! Meg faltered slightly upon seeing this, and his pupils contracted slightly at the sight of the gargantuan creature hurtling toward them like a bolt of purple lightning. It was a purple griffin. As for the purple lines that glowed under the lightning, he was even more certain that this was Alex's mount, the purple-striped griffin, and its name was Ozzy. The Void Ancestor faltered slightly upon hearing this roar, and the fury in his eyes burned even brighter at the sight of the purple-striped griffin. A ball of green flames appeared in his right hand, and he slapped it into the eye beast's head as a cold smile appeared on his face. Little purple bird, seeing as you still dare to show yourself, I'll make sure you die with me this time. Roar! The eye beast immediately let loose a thunderous roar, and red and green intertwined all over its body. A hint of green appeared in its deathly white eyes, and its rapidly growing tentacles became twice as thick as before as they hurtled toward Meg like a mass of red meat. The purple griffin landed in front of Meg, and almost at the exact same moment, countless tentacles crashed into the ground where Meg and the others were standing. The ground caved in by 1/2 meter, and the entangling tentacles were like mountains of flesh. Meg and the others were nowhere to be seen. The entire battlefield suddenly fell silent, and the only sound that could be heard was the sound of the torrential rain and the squirming tentacles. Everything seemed to have come to an end. Ha, so weak. The spatial demon patriarch looked down at the mountain of flesh before pursing his lips with disdain. No one had ever been able to escape from the eye beast's control, and they were going to be tamed and reduced to lowly slaves. Boom! Chapter 774. Severed tentacles and eyeballs flew through the air as a purple-striped griffin rose up into the air, pointing directly at the spatial patriarch like a sharp sword. The thick and powerful tentacles were sliced into chunks like tofu by the heavy black sword, and even though they were regenerating at a frantic rate, they were still unable to stop the oncoming griffin. It was unstoppable. How is this possible? The spatial patriarch's eyes almost popped out of their sockets upon seeing this. A hint of panic appeared in his eyes as he looked at the sharp black sword. Someone had once said that Alex was like a tiger with wings when riding a griffin, and that there was no one in this world that he couldn't kill. The two groups of black-robed men finally arrived at the intersection of the 5th Street on their unicorn steeds. They looked up at the eye beast, which was riddled with eyeballs, and the fearless black-robed man on his purple-striped griffin, and they couldn't help but stop on their mounts with awe and incredulity in their eyes. Irina had her arms wrapped tightly around the black-robed man's waist, and her body was pressed tightly against his. This was a very familiar sight to the people of Rodu. Back when Alex had still been alive, he had often been seen riding his purple-striped griffin in and out of Rodu with Princess Irina. However, no one would have thought that this would be repeated 3 years later. The tentacles were several dozen meters in length, and some of them were even several meters thick. They came crashing down through the air, tearing spatial rifts into the air. The tentacles were filled with countless eyeballs, creating quite a terrifying sight to behold. However, the griffin continued to fly up into the air without any fear. Countless tentacles fell from the sky, but they were unable to stop the griffin in the slightest. "What do we do now, Captain?" one of the black-robed men asked in a quiet voice. "If you think you can hit them, then you can give it a try," the captain said with a bitter expression. The team leader wore a wry expression as he spoke. This was a battle between the most powerful beings on the Norland continent, so there was nothing that mere 7th-tier underlings like them could do. They were only following the second prince's orders, so they had no choice but to charge forward. Irina had her arms tightly around Meg's waist, and she rested her head gently on his broad shoulders. She basked in his aura and body that she hadn't felt in a long time, and she almost wanted to melt into his body. It had been 3 years, and she was finally hugging him again. Just when she thought she was going to die here, he appeared. The way he stood in front of her was still as charming as ever. He was still that unique man. Hugging this familiar yet strange body, he could feel that the heart was still boiling hot. Even the cold autumn rain could not cool it down. "It's him. Alex." The news she had heard in the cave 3 years ago had almost broken her heart. She didn't even dare to imagine that they would meet again. She lived for the sake of revenge. She wanted to find those despicable fellows and kill them one by one. But now, she had found him again. She hugged him tightly, not wanting to let go at all. She didn't want to be separated from him again. "Miss, aren't you affecting my performance?" Meg's heart began to race uncontrollably as he felt the 2 balls of softness and warmth on his back. Meg Shin's reputation as an unperturbed man had been around for a long time. He had seen all kinds of women. Even if a beautiful woman were to stand before him in the nude, he wouldn't even bat an eyelid. But now, his heart was racing because Irina was hugging him from behind. Meg was rather surprised by this feeling. However, Meg didn't have any time to think about this. The countdown had already reached 2 minutes, and he had to take care of the spatial demon patriarch within these 2 minutes, then get out of here before more powers arrived. What powerful spatial magic waves! Could it be that old bastard from the spatial demon race is here? Who's fighting him? On the 2nd floor of a tavern, Novan turned toward the northern part of the city with a hint of surprise and confusion in his eyes. "You're saying that old bastard Benson is here in Rodu? And he's fighting someone?" Crassus immediately put down his wine glass upon hearing this, and turned to Novan with an intense gaze. Aside from him, no one else in this world can create such a huge commotion with spatial magic. His eye beast is most likely here as well, and it's currently on the 5th Street in the northern part of the city. Nova nodded. The 5th Street. Crassus paused for a moment before suddenly rising to his feet. Crap, Irina has most likely been tricked. How do you know it's Her Highness? Novan was a little perplexed. Alex was killed on the 5th Street in the past. It's a pity that I just so happened to be away from Rodu on that day. Aside from His Majesty, Josh, and Sean, the only one in Rodu who can make that old bastard Benson step in is Irina. Crassus looked at Novan with an urgent expression, and said, "Aren't spatial magic your forte? Hurry up and set up a teleportation spell formation so that I can get there. If Irina is injured in the slightest, I'll crush that old bastard Benson and his disgusting beast with my staff. I'll need some time." Novan didn't waste any time. The ring on his right hand flashed, and a series of crystals fell onto the ground beside the table, upon which a complex spell formation began to appear. These old bastards are becoming more and more unruly. Do they think that Rodu is a place where they can come and go as they please? On the top floor of the tallest palace in the royal palace, Andrei wore a cold expression as he looked toward the northern part of the city with killing intent in his eyes. The black shadow behind him moved slightly, but didn't say anything, as if it were waiting for Andrei's command. They've challenged my bottom line over and over again. The longer these old bastards live, the more they don't know how to cherish their own lives. Andrei withdrew his hand from the railing, and clasped it behind his back as he said in a cold voice, "Then don't let him go back." "Yes." The black shadow swayed before disappearing without a trace. "Alex, I hope you won't disappoint me this time. If you can be a good boy, you'll have a place in the Roth Empire." The purple-striped griffin continued onward with unstoppable force. The violent tentacles were unable to impede it in the slightest, and the spatial rifts were also easily evaded by the purple-striped griffin. The perfect synergy between the sword, man, and griffin was like a single entity, and there was no need for any communication between them. Almost in the blink of an eye, the griffin had already reached the eye beast's massive body. There were countless eyeballs all over its body, and there wasn't even a single inch of space to be found. Even with Meg's mental fortitude, he was still feeling rather uncomfortable being stared at by so many dead fish eyes at such a close distance. The severed tentacles squirmed violently before regenerating at a rate discernible to the naked eye. Chapter 775. The battle taking place on the 5th Street had attracted the attention of many residents in the northern part of the city. All of the powerful beings in Rodu were also looking toward the northern part of the city, but not many of them went to spectate the battle. A battle between 10th-tier powerful beings was very entertaining to watch, but not everyone could be alive to watch it. The military and city defense forces had also received orders not to attack. The torrential downpour continued to wash over the streets of Rodu, and everyone was trying to guess who would dare to cause such a huge commotion in Rodu. There were also people who thought back to that rainy night 3 years ago, which had also taken place on the 5th Street in the northern part of the city, but the commotion on that night was even louder than that of today. On that night, the battle god of the Roth Empire, Alex, had been killed, and a legend of a generation had fallen. Someone important had definitely died on that night, but no one knew who it would be this time. The normal citizens only thought that it was just a few claps of thunder on a rainy night, and they rolled over before falling asleep again. However, many people were unable to sleep, wondering what would happen after that night. In the second prince's manor, in the small kitchen, Amy sat by the window and scooped up a spoonful of ice cream cake with a small spoon. The pink ice cream and the creamy yellow mousse cake had very distinct layers, and the sweet aroma of the cake immediately wafted through the air. When combined with the faint aroma of strawberries, Amy's eyes immediately lit up. She opened her mouth and placed the cake into her mouth. The smooth ice cream melted in her mouth, fusing as one with the soft and fragrant cake. The wonderful taste made Amy's eyebrows curl into crescents, and her little face lit up with bliss. After swallowing the cake, She nodded, and said, "Father, this ice cream cake is so delicious." Meg, who had been conjured by magic, stood off to the side and looked at her with a smile. Looks like Master Meg made delicious food for his daughter again. What an enviable pair of mother and daughter. I wonder why His Highness instructed me to come and see them. Under the eaves not far away, the housekeeper stood on her tiptoes and looked in the direction of the small kitchen. From her position, she could see Amy and Meg in the kitchen through the half-open window. She scratched her head in confusion and hid under the eaves again. Under the heavy rain, the temperature dropped even lower. Wearing only a thin gown, he shivered and stood on his tiptoes to take a look. He muttered, "They're eating delicious food in the warm kitchen. There's no need for me to stand guard here. I'll report to His Highness when he returns." After saying that, he shrunk his head and walked along the corridor. "What will Father do? If you leave in such a hurry, will you encounter bad people?" Amy glanced in the direction where the manager had been standing. She looked at the pouring rain outside the window and thought to herself worriedly. "But the ice cream is about to melt. What a pity. Let's eat it then." Amy looked at the ice cream cake in front of her, nodded seriously, and picked up the spoon again. All of the dead fish eyes in the sky were glowing with a faint green light, as if they were a school of sharks that had smelled blood. They flew toward the griffin in a frenzy, and even the raindrops were unable to fall. The spatial demon patriarch also had a crazed look on his face. He spread open his arms, and two round plates appeared in his hands. He slowly brought them together toward the griffin down below as he yelled, "Spatial millstone. Obliterate all things." The space directly below the eye beast began to twist and warp as if it were being forcibly compressed by something. Countless spatial rifts appeared in an area of several dozen meters, some of which were even several meters in length. They were like a series of sharp swords that were suspended in midair. The green eyeballs fell into the inky black spatial rifts, and they immediately exploded into green liquid before instantly disappearing into the spatial turbulence. This space was like a compressed crystal, and countless cracks had appeared on its surface, as if it were going to shatter at any moment. At the center of this crystal, Meg's expression was still as calm as ever as he stood atop the griffin's back. His heavy sword was held horizontally before him, and he seemed to be ready to strike at any moment. Irina's arms were wrapped around Meg's waist, and she was also completely unconcerned. As long as she could lean against him, there seemed to be no danger at all as he was always able to resolve all problems perfectly. The purple-striped griffin with a wingspan of over 10 meters nimbly traversed through the cracks in space. The tiny cracks left scratches on its body, and blood gushed out from the wounds. However, the griffin did not slow down its speed in the slightest. There was no fear in its resolute gaze, only fearlessness. Green eyeballs had already surged forth, and they were so densely packed that it seemed as if they were trying to squeeze the griffin. The sound of space being torn apart made one's teeth itch. Densely packed spatial cracks filled the entire space, and it was as if two invisible hands were slowly closing in on each other. It was already on the verge of collapse. The group of black-robed men on the 5th Street looked on with awe and horror in their eyes. Regardless of whether it was the massive eye beast or the spatial rifts, they were both terrifying and unstoppable in their eyes. Meanwhile, the griffin was like a moth flying toward a flame, looking extremely frail and feeble, as if it could be swatted to death by the spatial turbulence at any moment. "Alex! Die!" Josh was hovering in midair atop his griffin, and he was also looking toward the 5th Street. Within the spatial rifts, the griffin carrying the two of them became extremely prominent. Josh's expression became even more deranged at the sight of Meg and Irina. He gritted his teeth as he whipped his silver griffin's back, and it immediately flew toward the 5th Street. "Irina, I'm going to save you this time. Your Highness." The magic caster's expression changed drastically as he looked at the eye beast and spatial patriarch with a hint of fear in his eyes. He hesitated momentarily before looking at Josh, who had already flown several dozen meters away. He gritted his teeth and kicked the giant falcon beneath his feet, and the falcon immediately flapped its wings before flying toward the 5th Street. If anything were to happen to Josh, then there was no way that he would be able to survive. The second prince was extremely intelligent, but he still couldn't get past Princess Irina. If she were to die here today, perhaps it would be a good thing for him instead. Of course, he could only keep these thoughts in his mind. Cracking sounds could be heard, and the cracks that were densely packed together like a spider web almost instantly connected together. The entire space collapsed in an instant, and countless green eyeballs exploded at the same time, like green fireworks exploding in the air, accelerating the collapse of the space. A massive black hole appeared, and it was as if a massive mouth had been opened in the air, engulfing even light. Chapter 776. A speck of light lit up within the darkness, as if it were the rising sun. The collapsed black hole was torn apart by this light, and a green magic barrier appeared around the griffin's body. A silver arc of light erupted from the tip of the sword, and it pierced through the air like a bolt of lightning. Countless eyeballs exploded outside the magic barrier, and the spatial turbulence unleashed by the collapsed black hole crashed into the magic barrier in a frenzy, but it was only able to make it tremor slightly. A streak of green light flew through the air from the distance before landing on the magic barrier. There seemed to be a steady stream of energy flowing into the magic barrier, making it even more substantial. The black hole was sliced open, and the eye beast let loose a roar of shock and horror before it was sliced in half, and a black ball of magic around the size of an adult's head exploded into countless fragments. Crap! The spatial demon patriarch's expression changed drastically as he stacked the 2 golden plates in his hands together before abruptly pressing them downward. An inky black spatial rift appeared behind him, and he immediately stepped into the spatial rift. The eye beast was sliced in half, and the 2 halves of its massive carcass and innards fell from the sky like a puddle of blood. The stacked golden plates began to revolve violently amid rumbling thunderclaps, as if they were about to explode. The long sword landed on the plates, and a silver sword projection pierced through their centers. A thunderous explosion rang out, and the overlapping golden discs were instantly torn apart, turning into countless fragments that shot out in all directions. The heavy sword continued onward, following the spatial demon patriarch into the spatial rift that was about to close. Rip! Green blood erupted from within the spatial rift, accompanied by a blood-curdling cry. The spatial rift twisted and warped, and the spatial demon patriarch fell out of thin air several hundred meters away with a deathly pale expression. "Alex, I'm going to kill you next time. Only then will I be able to assuage the hatred in my heart." The spatial demon patriarch stared at Meg with a hint of shock and horror in his eyes. He crushed a golden bead in his hand, and the space around him instantly collapsed into a black hole. He also disappeared in the blink of an eye, and countless raindrops were drawn toward the black hole in a frenzy by the terrifying suction force. "My man is still so handsome." Irina looked at Meg's back, her eyes full of sparkling stars. She loved it when he sheathed his sword after defeating his opponent. Many people had been defeated by his sword, and all of them were powerful beings on the Norland continent. Alex actually won. The mouths of the black-robed men at the intersection of the 5th Street gaped open as they looked at the purple-striped griffin and the slowly shrinking black hole. Their faces were filled with shock, and they could hardly believe what they had just seen. The terrifying eye beast and the spatial demon patriarch were almost invincible, but that man had vanquished them with a single sword strike. "Invincible war god," one of the black-robed men swallowed his saliva and mumbled dryly. One by one, the legends about Alex began to emerge in their memories. The legend who could slay dragons in the sky was known as the strongest knight. 3 years ago, he was rumored to have died. And in these 3 years, they had been constantly searching for him, wanting to kill him so that they could succeed. Only now did they realize how naive they had been. Alex, who had been rumored to be completely powerless, had reappeared. He had slain 3 10th-tier powerful beings, slain the Eye Beast, and severely wounded the spatial demon patriarch. A legend had reappeared. You're still the boss after all. From this day forth, all of the organizations searching for Alex would most likely disappear. Who in this world dared to claim that they could kill Alex at his peak? No one. Above the rain of blood, the man sitting on the back of the griffin was the embodiment of invincibility. It's time to go. On the griffin's back, Meg heaved an internal sigh of relief. It was a pity that he hadn't been able to kill the midget, but at the very least, he had saved Irina. The most important thing now was to find a way to make a perfect exit. A faint green magic barrier kept the rain at bay, and wisps of green light flowed toward Irina's body from within the magic barrier. In the distant sky, a green light was still flowing into the magic barrier like an antenna. Her pale features gradually began to recover, but she had no intention of letting go of Meg's waist. There's a cat over there. Meg was just about to ask Z to take him away from here when Irina suddenly pointed down at the rubble below. There was a large leaf there that was glowing with a green light, like a huge umbrella, holding up the sky above the rubble. A black cat was trembling as it hid beneath the leaf, meowing softly. A dozen black-robed men on unicorns were waiting at the 5 streets, and 2 black dots in the distance were galloping in their direction. Meg hesitated for a moment, then turned the griffin's direction and swooped down. Disperse. The black-robed men's faces were filled with fear. They had just witnessed Meg's terrifying strength when he killed the giant beast with a single strike. Now that he was rushing toward them, they couldn't summon any will to resist. They pulled their unicorns and wanted to retreat. Several magic barriers instantly erupted from the magicians' bodies. Even though they knew it was useless, they still hoped that they could hold on for a while longer. Despair instantly spread among the black-robed men. Many of them were already regretting why they dared to stand in front of Alex, and even wanted to find him and kill him. Now that they had found him, they would be the ones to die. The griffin swooped down with a whistling wind. The unicorns were so frightened that their hooves went soft, and they knelt on the ground as if they were welcoming their king. The black-robed men's hearts were filled with despair. They didn't even have the chance to escape now. They could only watch as the griffin swooped down with its sharp claws. However, just as the black-robed men were filled with fear and thought that they were about to face a massacre, the purple-striped griffin stopped in front of them. Irina bent down and gently picked up the black cat from the ruins. The black cat meowed and licked Irina's finger before curling up in her arms. The purple-striped griffin flapped its wings and flew over the heads of the black-robed men. The fierce wind brought about by the griffin almost flipped the black-robed men over. Everyone raised their heads to look at the griffin and the man sitting upright on its back. At the same time, they felt a little bitter in their hearts after surviving a calamity. Clearly, they didn't even have the right to be looked at, and they didn't have the right to make him draw his sword. Alex, leave Irina behind. Right at this moment, Josh also arrived at the 5th Street on his griffin. He glowered at Irina, who was holding Meg in her arms, and pointed his wand at Meg as golden light began to materialize. Since you're here, then don't think about leaving. Chapter 777. The purple-striped griffin abruptly accelerated as it slashed its black sword through the air. Cold silver sword projection erupted from the tip of the sword, slicing through the rain droplets. Josh's face instantly paled at the sight of the approaching sword, and a bone-chilling sensation instantly enshrouded his body. His sinister killing intent was completely undisguised, and the black mask on his face appeared quite sinister in the darkness, but he was sure that this was Alex. Furthermore, he really wasn't holding back in the slightest on this occasion. 3 10th-tier powerful beings and an eye beast had just been slain, and the spatial demon patriarch had fled with severe injuries. The stench of blood and gore wafting through the air was quite nauseating, but it also made him feel even more awake. This was the man who had slain countless enemy soldiers and powerful beings on the northwestern border of the Empire, and he was trying to kill him. Golden light was still converging on the tip of his wand, and the prelude to a high-level spell was always so long. He could clearly tell that he most likely wouldn't be able to successfully unleash his spell before that sword struck him. This was a disparity that struck despair into his heart. For the first time in his life, Josh was struck by despair. He suddenly regretted coming here today, and why he had been blinded by jealousy and rushed toward Alex. After what he had done, he knew that Alex would never show mercy to him. At such a close distance, who would be able to stop Alex in his peak condition? At the very least, the elderly magic caster behind him wouldn't be able to do so. A series of magic barriers appeared around his body. These were all defensive items gifted to him by the magic casters of the Magus Tower, and some of them had been crafted by Richard himself. It was said that these barriers could withstand the attacks of 10th-tier powerful beings for a short period of time. Even so, Josh still didn't feel safe in the slightest. This man was Alex, and he couldn't be judged by common sense. Your Highness. The elderly magic caster's expression also changed drastically at the sight of Meg flying toward Josh atop his purple-striped griffin. He pointed his wand at Meg, and red flames lit up as a fire raven flew out of the red light. It abruptly flapped its wings and instantly flew past Josh before crashing into the purple-striped griffin. Kill him. Irina took a glance at Joshua before looking at Meg's back with a hint of a smile in her eyes. If it were him from back in the day, he would have considered things a lot more, but he's becoming more and more like me. If we kill him, we'll make a killing. Meg glanced at the 10-second countdown timer. Josh could be said to be the instigator of everything, so he was naturally on his must-kill list. Furthermore, he was at the top of his list. No one knew how long it would take for him to return to his peak condition, and there clearly weren't many opportunities for him to recover to his peak condition. If Tang Wulin could take advantage of this opportunity to kill him, then that would be the greatest reward that Tang Wulin could reap from this trip to Rodu. The sharp heavy sword split the Firebird in half, and the rising flames were instantly annihilated, not even leaving behind a single spark. With over a dozen magic barriers around his body, Joshua arrived before the purple-striped griffin. His eyes were wide open as he stared at the purple-striped griffin that was rushing out from the Firebirds like a god of death. The griffin that Joshua was sitting on seemed to have also been struck by despair and horror. Its trembling body attempted to turn around and flee, but it almost caused Joshua to fall from the mount. 5, 4, 3, the system's mechanical countdown sounded in Meg's mind, and the flashing red that had already turned into a long, bright red light. Meg's eyes narrowed slightly, and his hand that was holding onto his sword had never been so steady before. All of the battle intent in his mind had been activated, and this was going to be his most powerful strike. Right at this moment, a black shadow stepped out from the dark alleyway. A dangerous light abruptly lit up in Meg's eyes. The heavy sword pierced through the layers of protective barriers, and it was as if it were puncturing a series of balloons. Even the protective barriers that Richard had constructed himself weren't able to stop the sword in the slightest. A hint of despair appeared in Josh's eyes at the sight of the sword. He suddenly recalled the scene from many years ago when he had first met that elven girl in the Magus Tower. He had purposely attracted the old magic caster's attention so that the elven girl, who had made a shushing gesture at him, could successfully ascend to the top floor of the Magus Tower. After that, she had written down the words, "Irina was here," on the top floor of the Magus Tower. And that elven girl was now sitting behind Meg, intimately hugging his waist. No! The old magic caster let loose a shrill cry, but he was unable to unleash his second spell. Your Highness! The black-robed figures who had yet to recover from their shock also couldn't help but exclaim at the same time. If Josh were to die here, then none of them would be able to survive. The black shadow that was still hidden in the darkness raised his hand, and a black vortex began to appear in his hand. Josh closed his eyes. The thing that he regretted the most in his life was not listening to their advice and killing Alex all those years ago. The expressions of horror on the faces of the old magic caster and the black-robed figures froze. This sword could very well take their lives as well. There was no one in this world who could stop Alex at such a close distance. The tip of the sword pierced through the final layer of the magic barrier, and the silver blade sliced through the wand. It was only less than an inch away from Josh's neck before it barely missed its mark, but it still managed to leave a rather deep gash on his neck. The blade of his sword turned, and the griffin beneath Josh was sliced in half at the waist. Josh let loose a cry of surprise as he clutched at his neck and plummeted from the sky, landing in a pool of blood and internal organs. He stared blankly at the griffin that was hovering in midair. "You didn't kill me 3 years ago, so I'll return the favor this time. However, I'll definitely take your worthless life in the future." Meg stowed his heavy sword away as he looked down at Josh with a cold expression. He took a glance at the black shadow that had stepped back into the darkness, and the griffin flapped its wings, instantly disappearing into the rainy night as a black speck. Josh looked up at the direction that the griffin had disappeared in, and his face was deathly pale. He felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. Even though he didn't die, he had received a promise that he would die, and that sense of despair made him feel completely helpless. "Are you all right, Your Highness?" The old magic caster and the black-robed figures hurriedly rushed over, and the magic caster who was capable of healing immediately began to treat Josh's injuries. If anything were to happen to Josh, then all of them would have been killed. Right at that moment, a beam of light lit up on the 5th Street, and 2 old men emerged from a spell formation. The griffin flew out of the 5th Street in the blink of an eye, and it was flying toward the western part of the city like a sharp arrow. Chapter 778. Within the starry cave abode. The star that was on the brink of destruction began to gradually regain its brightness. Even though it wasn't as bright as before, it was becoming more and more stable, displaying an extremely resilient nature. Helena's expression gradually eased, and she reverted back to her usual calm self. Heidi, who was sitting on the ground, looked up at the star, and the hatred in her eyes became even more pronounced. All of the elves in the Wind Forest were looking up toward the west. The green light emanating from the Tree of Life was converging toward the west, and Princess Irina was currently in the Roth Empire. No one knew what had happened, but the Tree of Life's abnormal behavior seemed to indicate that something bad was about to happen. The Elven Queen, who was standing on the tallest tree in the Wind Forest, heaved a sigh of relief. However, she was still looking toward the northwest with a concerned expression as she murmured to herself, "Irina. What happened? If anyone dares to hurt you, I won't let them get away with it." On a treetop outside the Wind Forest, a slightly disheveled female elf stood on the treetop, looking up at the clear green light in the sky with a worried expression on her intricate features. What happened to Princess Irina in Rodu? Could it be that someone's done something to her? Blower murmured to himself as he stood guard here for over 10 days. Right at this moment, the sound of rustling footsteps suddenly sounded in the distance. Blower's expression changed slightly, and he used a dense layer of leaves to shield his body. He cast his gaze into the distance, and discovered that a team of several dozens of people was making their way toward them. The leader of the team was a demon, and there were 2 other demons and orcs standing guard beside him. In the middle of the team was an elf who had her hands bound and mouth gagged. In the darkness, the sound of footsteps and whips being whipped were extremely clear. "They're finally here." Blower looked at the team with fury burning in his eyes. His wand appeared in his hand, and he leaned forward slightly in preparation to attack. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. 3 arrows tore through the silence, and 2 demons and 1 orc were struck in the throats. The green light on the tips of the arrows exploded in their throats, and a bloody hole instantly appeared in their necks. They died almost instantly. "There's an ambush!" The leader of the demons roared and raised his hand. An earthen wall appeared in front of him. An arrow was nailed into the earthen wall. The tip of the arrow almost penetrated the earthen wall. After the explosion, dust filled the air. The escorting team suddenly became chaotic. The demons and orcs took out their weapons and looked around nervously, trying to find a target to attack. However, 2 demons were still nailed to the tree by arrows. A vigorous figure traversed through the forest, reaping the lives of demons and orcs with a bow and arrow like the Grim Reaper. "Why is she here?" Blower was just about to spring into action when a hint of surprise appeared on his face at the sight of the demon traversing through the trees. He immediately pointed his wand at the leader of the demons, upon which green light quickly converged to form a saber-tooth that pounced toward the demon. "Where is he?" Crassus and Novin emerged from the teleportation spell formation. Their brows furrowed slightly at the sight of the fearful and wary black-robed figures, as well as Josh, who was being protected by them. They then looked at the 5 streets that had almost been razed to the ground, and their brows furrowed even further. "It's Alex. I didn't think he would still be alive." Novin looked around with a hint of surprise on his face. Crassus walked around in a circle, and clicked his tongue as he said, 6 10th-tier demons, and even Benson's eye monster was killed. He should have been injured as well. Alex and Irina really are a force to be reckoned with. I was worried for nothing. "I can't afford to mess with them," Novin murmured to himself with a concerned expression. "Orcs, demons, and forest trolls are all targeting Princess Irina in Rodu. The situation is getting more and more chaotic. It looks like they don't want peace anymore. That's not necessarily the case. 3 years ago, over a dozen 10th-tier demons died trying to kill Alex. This time, another 6 died trying to kill Irina, and 1 was severely injured. In the end, neither Alex nor Irina died." Crassus shook his head with a smile, and said, "Now, they should be considering whether they can defeat the humans and elves if a war breaks out. Greetings, Master Novin and Master Crassus." Josh stood up with the help of the black-robed figures, and cupped his fist in a respectful salute toward the 2 of them. His face was still deathly pale. Crassus took a glance at Josh and the griffin that had been sliced in half, and a hint of mockery appeared on his face as he said, "I didn't think that the second prince would get here so quickly. However, you look a little disheveled. Did you get injured by accident? I heard that if you walk around at night too often, there's always a chance of encountering ghosts. Have you heard of this before?" Josh's expression darkened slightly, but he still tried his best to remain calm as he said, "I was worried about Princess Irina's safety, so I rushed here as quickly as I could." "Then, have you seen Alex?" Crassus continued to ask, completely ignoring Josh's dark expression. "Alex is already dead. A black-robed figure took Princess Irina away. I don't know if he has any ill intentions, but I'll send someone to pursue him." Josh shook his head as he averted his gaze. "I see. Then you'd better send someone to pursue him. After all, we won't be so lucky every time." Crassus nodded before turning to Novin with a hearty smile, and said, "Let's go and have a few more drinks to celebrate Alex's survival." The feeling of exhaustion came from every muscle in his body. Meg felt as if his soul had already floated outside of his body, and he couldn't control his body at all. It was a feeling as if all the energy in his body had been sucked out. He finally understood what the system meant by after effects. He suddenly felt a lingering fear. If Ozzy hadn't appeared, then he might have been sitting in an alley somewhere near the 5th Street, and then killed by a black-robed figure. If it weren't for the warm embrace behind him, then he might have fallen off the griffin's back and become a bloody mess on a building. The embrace was indeed very warm and soft. Even in his current state, Meg could still feel the warmth coming from his head and face, as well as the faint orchid fragrance in the air. "Alex, what's wrong with you?" Irina asked with a nervous expression as she hugged Meg, who seemed to have lost all his bones. Green light flowed from her fingertips into Meg's chest, and the green light that surged from the distant sky was already so thin that it couldn't be seen. Meg, who was still fighting valiantly just a moment ago, suddenly became limp as if he had lost all of his power. Even his heartbeat had slowed to a crawl, and she was at a loss as to what to do with this abnormal change. Life magic quickly nourished Meg's body, and his heart began to beat again. His numb muscles began to recover, and his overdrawn cells recovered. Meg's fingers twitched, and he continued to lie in the warm embrace in silence. "How much longer are you going to pretend?" Chapter 779. Over 50 kilometers to the southwest of Rodu, space warped, and a portly figure with blood all over his body tumbled out of a black spatial rift with a hand clasped over his chest. A black longsword silently pierced through the darkness, piercing into Benson's heart from behind. The tip of the sword protruded out of his chest before being slowly pulled out. Hee. Benson's widened eyes were filled with indignation as he turned around and looked at the shadow that was almost completely hidden in the darkness. His eyes were filled with disbelief as his fat body collapsed to the ground. Even in death, his eyes did not close. Within the spatial holy palace, the soul lamp at the very top of the palace exploded. The old man guarding the palace faltered momentarily before his eyes were filled with horror and incredulity. "The patriarch is dead." An urgent bugle horn sounded throughout the entire spatial demon race territory, and some of the more powerful demons hurriedly rushed out of their cave abodes toward the spatial holy palace. This was the most urgent bugle horn of the spatial demon race. All spatial demons at or above the 7th tier had to immediately rush to the spatial holy palace upon hearing this bugle horn. Otherwise, they would be severely punished. Several elders of the Void Demon clan gathered together to discuss something with a solemn expression, while the ordinary demons stood in the main hall with blank expressions. News of Benson's death quickly spread among all of the demons who had arrived at the spatial holy palace. Emotions of grief and horror quickly spread among the demons. Benson's power was one of the main reasons why the spatial demon race was ranked as the 3rd most powerful demon race. "The patriarch has been in seclusion for a long time. How did he suddenly die?" a spatial demon asked with a perplexed expression. The old demon guarding the palace replied with a grief-stricken expression. "The patriarch said that he was going to take a trip to Rodu less than an hour after receiving the news. Then, his soul lamp exploded, indicating that he's already dead. This most likely has something to do with the humans. How could a mere human kill the patriarch? Alex is already dead. Is there anyone else in the human race who can grow up? Indeed. The patriarch is so powerful that he ranks among the top 3 most powerful demons in the spatial demon race. On top of that, he has the Eye-Beast to assist him, who can stop him if he wants to leave." The demons were still full of doubts. They were obviously unable to accept this result. Of course, more of them were fearful of the future of the Void Demon race. After losing their ancestor, the suppression that the Void Demons would face could already be foreseen. An elderly spatial demon strode out with a piece of black metal in his hand, and yelled, "Alex isn't dead." Before the patriarch passed away, he sent us a message stating that he encountered Alex in Rodu and was severely wounded. However, he's already left Rodu and is on his way back to our race. He died on the way back, and we still don't know who killed him. The hall suddenly quieted down. All the demons looked at the black piece of metal in the demon's hand with fear in their eyes. Alex is not dead. This news was as confusing as Benson's death. The patriarch is dead, but Alex is still alive. Will he take revenge on the Void Tribe? After a long silence, a demon asked fearfully. As soon as he said that, many demons showed concern on their faces. Even the spatial dimension patriarch had been severely injured or even killed by him, so how could they possibly be a match for him? The patriarch is dead. The third elder's lamp has been snuffed out. Similar events were taking place in many demon, orc, and forest troll tribes on that night, and emotions of grief and horror were spreading like wildfire. This made many people think back to that night 3 years ago, when countless tribes and races had lost their pillars of support, all because of Alex. On this occasion, no one knew what had happened in Rodu, and who had killed all of those 10th-tier powerful beings before more information was sent back to Rodu. On the central island of the Demon Islands, there was an inky black hole. On the top of the hall, 2 black figures stood 2 meters apart from each other. One of them was thin, while the other was fat, and both of them were looking toward Rodu. Benson is dead. The fat demon broke the silence. I didn't think that Alex would still be alive. The skinny demon said in a deep voice, with a hint of anger in his voice. The fat demon clenched his fists with rage, and said, 3 years ago, our demon race sacrificed 4 10th-tier warriors in order to kill him. This time, 2 more 10th-tier warriors died in order to kill Irina, and even Benson was killed. We've lost almost a third of our demon race's powerful beings, but we didn't get anything out of it. Instead, we've been severely wounded. The thin demon quickly calmed down, and said, our 3 races have lost so many powerful beings in quick succession, yet the human race hasn't paid any price at all. Do you think it's possible that Josh and Alex were putting on a show 3 years ago to kill all of the 10th-tier powerful beings sent by our 3 races, and then spread the news that Alex is dead? Furthermore, the human race already has more 10th-tier powerful beings than any of our 3 races. If he formed an alliance with the elves and dwarves, our 3 races may not be able to defeat them. Cunning humans. The fat demon gritted his teeth as he looked at the thin demon, and said, then what should we do now? Andre is an old fox. Over the past few decades, the human race has become more and more powerful under his leadership. However, his 2 sons are still very young, and they aren't as cunning as Andre. A cold smile appeared on the thin demon's face, and he said, the lifespan of a human is short. Andre, that old fox, will die sooner or later. When he dies, it'll be time for us to declare war on the human race. Then what about the peace agreement in 3 months? The fat demon frowned. Sign it first, and give them everything they want. It'll be ours sooner or later anyway. Meg, who was lying in Irina's warm embrace, opened his eyes in embarrassment. What he saw was a majestic chest and a beautiful face with a hint of anger. He pushed his hands to the side in an attempt to stand up. As a result, his hands pressed against a patch of delicate and smooth skin. The firm and elastic texture made Meg absent-minded for a moment. After meeting Irina's meaningful gaze, he almost jumped up from the griffin's back. As he sat up, he hurriedly withdrew his hands from those slender legs. Meg didn't dare to look into Irina's eyes, and was momentarily at a loss for words. Irina looked at Meg with a playful smile, and asked, how does it feel? This. Meg looked at the playful smile on Irina's face, and calmed down immediately. What a joke, as a man who had seen countless beauties, how could he be afraid in front of a woman? He nodded with a smile, and said, it's delicate and smooth, slim but not fleshy. It feels great. Chapter 780. Even though he had seen the sea of flowers, Meg was still terrified. Just as his hand was about to touch that soft ball, he withdrew his hand like lightning. Sure enough, he wasn't afraid of forceful or gentle people, but he was afraid of people who didn't play by the rules. Although Meg wasn't very shameless, he was a person who kept his nose clean. He couldn't just touch anyone who asked him to. That went against his principles. Damn it, after so many years, you still haven't changed at all. Irina looked at Meg's frightened expression and let out a bell-like laugh, as if she had thought of something very funny. Meg looked at Irina with mixed feelings. Alex's memories had merged with his, but he still couldn't calmly treat himself as Alex and accept Irina. Alex had deleted all memories related to Irina. To him, she was just an elf girl whom he had only known for 2 days. Although she was Amy's mother and had an extremely beautiful appearance and a likable straightforward personality, Meg still couldn't calmly embrace her using Alex's identity. Was he that kind of person? It's been 3 years, I've finally found you. Irina threw herself into Meg's arms and hugged him tightly as if she wanted to meld herself into his body. Her murmur was filled with joy and difficulty. Meg's outstretched arms froze for a moment. He felt the little girl in his arms like a little girl, and his heart gradually softened. He slowly retracted his arms. One of his arms was around her waist, and the other hand was stroking her back gently. This girl who had once left her name on the Magus Tower, this elf princess who dared to face 6 10th-tier powerhouses alone, this woman who dared to challenge the entire world for him and Amy, at this moment, seemed so petite and weak. The torrential rain continued to fall outside the magic barrier, but there was no need for words or consolation. Meg held Irina gently in his arms and just wanted to bask in this moment of peace. In that instant, an impulse suddenly welled up in his heart. If Irina became the lady boss of the restaurant, perhaps it would be very interesting for the 3 of them to live together as a family. The griffin continued to fly toward the west before landing at the entrance of the cave on Amnesty Mountain. It turned to look at Mag with an excited expression, and let loose a couple of cries. Howl. You're a griffin, not a husky. Meg rolled his eyes and couldn't help but grumble internally. How could a griffin let out such a cry? Irina sat up in Meg's arms and looked at Meg's mask. Is there something on my face? Meg asked, feeling a little uncomfortable being stared at. Irina nodded. It's a little ugly. Meg felt as if something was stuck in his throat. He suddenly felt as if he had met his match. Irina pulled Meg's mask up to reveal his face. After a brief daze, she nodded with a pleased expression. That's a lot better. Meg was also slightly dazed. In order to avoid any awkwardness, he dismounted from the griffin's back and began to inspect the cave. The magic barrier had already been withdrawn by Irina, and a green ball of light hovered beside her, illuminating the entire cave with its gentle light. There were signs of griffin activity everywhere, and there was a pile of bones in a corner of the cave. He looked at the purple-striped griffin, which was wagging its tail at him and rubbing its head against his body, and he was suddenly struck by a sense of pity. Meg gently stroked the scar on the griffin's forehead, and memories of the battles he had fought alongside it flashed through his mind. During these 3 years, it had been guarding this place, never leaving. When he needed help the most, it was like a divine soldier had descended from the heavens. No matter how dangerous the situation was, no matter how powerful the opponent was, it never seemed to be afraid. Aw-zee. Meg called out in a gentle voice. Haha, Aw-zee became even more excited. It wagged its tail vigorously and stuck out its tongue to lick Meg's face, just like a dog that hadn't seen its owner in a long time. Meg couldn't accept the eagerness of Aw-zee's saliva. He pressed down on Aw-zee's head, and ordered, "Sit down." Aw-zee is still as silly as ever after 3 years. I should have named it Silly Aw-zee. How about we change its name from today onward? Irina made her way over to Aw-zee, and patted its head with a serious expression. So she was the one who came up with this strange name. Meg slapped his forehead. She had named the cat Ugly Duckling, and she had named the griffin Aw-zee. This mother-daughter pair had perfectly inherited her talent for naming. Meg's heart ached for the griffin for a second before he tried to refuse. I don't think we should change its name. Aw, see, sounds like a good name. Irina shook her head with a serious expression and said, no, names are very important. Silly Acidos Griffin is just like its name, and it's so affectionate, just like our silly son. Well. Meg didn't know how to refute her words. Meg, Alex, which name would you like me to call you now? Irina interrupted Meg's train of thought. Let's call you Meg. Meg replied without any hesitation. Even though it wasn't a new name, perhaps a new name would be a good start for him. Meg. That's not a bad name either. Irina nodded as she walked around Meg 3 times with a scrutinizing look on her face. What happened 3 years ago? How did you become like this? What's with the peak power you just recovered? What did you experience with Amy during these 3 years? How did you learn to cook? Did you have any intimate contact with other women during these 3 years? The barrage of questions almost knocked Meg out cold. He was looking at Irina with a slightly different expression. He had thought that a fairy like her would be aloof from all matters, but who would have thought that she would be no different from an ordinary little girl? These questions are a little complicated to answer. If I were to answer all of them, it would take me 3 days and 3 nights to answer all of them. Meg averted his gaze slightly. What a joke. Was he supposed to tell her that he had transmigrated into this world and brought a system with him? Meg would never tell anyone about transmigrators and the system. It was not a good thing for someone to know about something that was beyond the imagination of this world. Chapter 781. Due to the fact that the Demon Alliance's plan had completely failed, and no one had kept the news under wraps, the news of Alex's survival quickly spread throughout Rodu as if it had sprouted wings. Anyone with a certain level of status was made aware of this, and it created quite a stir. Alex had already become a special symbol in the Roth Empire. He was the invincible war god on the border, and the dragon-slaying warrior who could fly into the sky and slay dragons. He was extremely revered in the hearts of the common people. He was the pride of the human race, and he had declared his sovereignty to the heavens, forcing the giant dragons to bow their heads to humans, who they had always viewed as ants. 3 years ago, Alex had passed away, and the entire empire was in mourning. Long lines of mourners from all over the Roth Empire stretched for close to 10 kilometers, demonstrating just how much he was loved and revered. Everyone believed that Alex had already passed away, as with his personality, there was no way that he would remain silent for 3 years. Who would have thought that Alex would appear again amid the thunderstorm tonight, and announce to the world that he was back? Many people in Rodu were destined to be sleepless that night. Your Highness, Alex has appeared and rescued Irina. The plan has failed. A black figure appeared outside the attic. Rainwater was dripping down from his clothes, and he appeared to be in quite a sorry state. Sean looked at the rain in silence for a long while before slowly turning around, and saying in a cold voice, "Kill some people and cut ties with me." Quine's expression stiffened, but he still immediately replied, "Yes," before disappearing into the rainy night again. "Alex, you're always the one who foils my plans. As expected, I shouldn't have kicked you out of that street 3 years ago." Sean looked at the rainy night sky of Rodu with a ferocious expression. "Benson is dead." On the top floor of the palace's tall tower, a figure silently appeared, and spoke in a slightly hoarse voice. "Very good." Andre was still looking outside, and a sense of pride welled up in his heart as he chortled, "I've been waiting for this day for several decades. If I can see the border of the Roth Empire as the border of the Norland continent before I die, my name will forever be etched into the history of the Norland continent." The black figure remained silent. "It's time to form a new alliance with the elves. These fools are excellent cannon fodder." Andre retracted his gaze and walked down the stairs. "The ice cream cake is really delicious, but where did Father go?" Isn't it a pity that I'm the only one eating such a delicious cake? In the kitchen, Amy looked at the ice cream cake that had a corner dug out with a look of pity on her face. The base of the ice cream cake had its own cooling function. Although the cooling effect couldn't reach 0 degrees Celsius after leaving the fridge, it was still quite effective in delaying the melting of the ice cream cake. At least for now, the ice cream cake didn't show any signs of melting. Meow meow, Ugly Duckling circled around Amy's chair over and over again, and looked up at the ice cream cake on the table with yearning in its eyes. It really loved ice cream, but it hadn't been able to eat it after coming to Rodu. Who would have thought that there would be such a massive ice cream cake here? It was even larger than its body, so it had to be super delicious. Amy looked down at Ugly Duckling with a serious expression, and said, "Father said that eating too much ice cream will make you fat." "Ugly Duckling, you're already so fat. If you keep eating ice cream, you'll become a roast goose soon." Meow. Ugly Duckling withdrew its head in a horrified manner, but it still couldn't get rid of the yearning in its eyes as it stared at the ice cream on the table. It was looking at Amy with a pitiable expression, and it was as if tears were about to flow from its eyes. "All right, then I'll only have a small bite," Amy said with a resigned expression. Meow meow. Ugly Duckling rubbed its little head against Amy's calf with excitement. "You're going to die from being fat." Amy stood up and placed a small plate on the ground. She then used a small knife to slice off a small piece of ice cream cake with some difficulty, and placed it onto the plate before carefully placing it on the ground. The triangular cake was covered with pink ice cream, and the creamy yellow cake could be seen through the side of the cut. There was also half a strawberry on top, and the aroma of the cake and strawberry wafted toward Ugly Duckling, making its eyes immediately light up. It slowly made its way over to the plate, and circled it around the plate twice before reaching out with its little pink paw to try and touch it. However, its paw stopped halfway, and it slowly withdrew its paw. It stuck its little pink nose forward to take a sniff, and a human-like elated smile appeared on its little face as it prepared to lick the cake. Right at this moment, a faint golden light lit up in the kitchen. Ugly Duckling faltered slightly upon seeing this. 2 figures appeared in the room. Splat! A pair of large feet appeared right above the cake, and the cake was squashed flat. Ice cream splattered all over Ugly Duckling's face, and it looked at the empty plate with confusion and grief. "Father! Big Sister Irina!" Amy was elated to see the 2 figures that had suddenly appeared in the room, and her eyes were filled with incredulity. Meg's foot slipped, and he had to grab onto a nearby table to prevent himself from falling. He looked down at the flattened ice cream cake, then met Ugly Duckling's aggrieved gaze, and he was immediately struck by a sense of guilt. He withdrew his foot with an awkward expression, and turned to Amy with a gentle smile as he said, "We're back, Amy." The battle that night had been very short, but it had been extremely perilous. The battle with Benson had been fraught with peril, and the final figure that had appeared on the 5th Street had most likely come from the Royal Palace. He was an opponent that even Alex couldn't fathom, as no one had ever seen him in action, and no one was even sure if he really existed. However, the fact that Andre had been able to sit on the throne for several decades seemed to indicate everything. He was sure that if he hadn't changed the direction of his final attack toward Josh, it would have been very difficult for him to leave the 5th Street after losing his peak power. However, he was also sure of one thing, and that was that Andre had already allowed him to live. Meg didn't feel that there was anything to be grateful for. He was more valuable to the Roth Empire alive than dead. Meg was feeling very fortunate that he had been able to return alive tonight. Of course, the most important thing was that he had successfully moved to another location and avoided Irina's barrage of questions. Those questions were extremely perilous, and Meg didn't dare to answer them for his own safety. Chapter 782. They had only eaten a corner of the ice cream cake on the table, and the slice was just enough to reveal the layers of the cake. The pink ice cream and creamy yellow cake were as intricately crafted as a work of art, and the intoxicating aroma wafted through the air. All of this made Irina's eyes light up. Meg was a little speechless. Irina had appeared to be very concerned about Amy in the cave, but who would have thought that she would be drawn to the ice cream cake as soon as she got to the kitchen? Could it be that Amy's foodie trait was also inherited? No, I was waiting for father to come back so that we could eat together. Amy shook her head before looking at Meg and Irina with a perplexed expression. Father, you said that you had something important to do, but you came back with big sister Irina. Looks like there's something more important than eating cake with Irina. Is it to change into some cool clothes and bring big sister Irina back to eat ice cream cake together? Well. Meg looked at Amy, contemplating how he should explain this to Amy. After all, it wasn't appropriate for him to tell her that he had abandoned her to save Irina, but he couldn't let her think that he didn't value her. Oh. I understand. It's all right. Before Meg had a chance to say anything, a thought suddenly occurred to Amy, and she shook her head generously as if she had seen through everything. What do you understand now? Meg looked at Amy's expression. He didn't know what she was thinking, but he didn't know how to explain it. Now was clearly not a good time to tell her that Irina was her mother. There were many people in this world who wanted to kill him, and he didn't have the power to protect Amy and Irina. 3 years ago, they dared to kill Alex in Rodu, and 3 years later, they dared to kill Irina in the same place. Once his identity was exposed, those people would know that he was in Chaos City and that his power had not recovered to its peak. Those people were bound to be like jackals and wolves that had smelled blood. At that time, neither he nor Irina could guarantee Amy's safety. Since there was no way to meet her openly, Meg was willing to postpone the meeting. Rather than letting her know who her mother was and not being able to meet her in the Wind Forest, Meg would rather let Amy worry about the moon for the time being. When he had the ability to protect them, he would tell her who her mother was. He had already mentioned this matter to Irina in the cave. She hesitated for a moment but still agreed with Meg's approach. If he brought me back because of something important, then it's still normal. But if he brought back another woman? Irina looked at Meg with a dangerous smile. A chill ran down Meg's spine, and he recoiled awkwardly. He looked at the projection of himself that was standing off to the side, and smiled as he said, "Let's put this illusion away for now, Amy." "All right." Amy nodded obediently. She waved her little hand, and the projection disappeared. Meow! Right at this moment, a feeble voice sounded from within Irina's wide sleeves, and a small black head popped out. Its green eyes carefully scanned the surroundings, and its timid appearance appeared rather pitiful. Ugly Duckling, who was looking at the ice cream cake that had been crushed by Meg's foot, faltered momentarily. It abruptly raised its head, and its back arched at the sight of the black cat. Its orange fur stood on end, and it was as if it had entered into a battle mode, ready to pounce at any moment. This was the first time it had seen another cat, and its reaction was even more exaggerated than when it had seen a giant dragon. Meow! The black cat was given a fright, and shrank its head back. Is it another ugly duckling? Amy looked at the black cat in Irina's hand with curiosity in her eyes. She carefully examined it for a while before shaking her head as she said, "No, it's much prettier than ugly duckling. This should be a little black cat, not ugly duckling." Meow! Ugly Duckling meowed at Amy with an aggrieved expression. Was it really that ugly? It was clearly much prettier than that black guy. It's all right, you're the ugliest. Amy squatted down and patted Ugly Duckling's head as she consoled it. Meow! Ugly Duckling lowered its head in dejection. The black cat carefully poked its head out again, and looked at Ugly Duckling with curiosity in its eyes. Irina held the black cat by the scruff of its neck, and carefully examined it for a while before nodding as she said, "You're so dark, so I'll call you Night." If anyone asks why you're so dark in the future, you can tell them it's because your name is Night. Is that a lame joke? Meg raised an eyebrow. Wow, that's such a cool name. Amy's eyes immediately lit up. She thought to herself for a moment before excitedly asking, then should we buy another white cat and name it Day? That's a good name. Irina nodded in agreement. She then looked at Night before shaking her head as she said, but let's talk about a white cat later. Day doesn't understand the darkness of night. Meg massaged his brows. As expected, the mother and daughter's brains were wired in tandem. Irina placed the black cat on the ground with a serious expression, and said, "Go play in the ground. If you can't even beat that fat orange, then don't tell anyone that you're my cat." As soon as Night landed on the ground, it reflexively shrank toward Irina's feet. Its emerald-like eyes were filled with curiosity as it looked at Ugly Duckling. After hearing Irina's words, it mustered up its courage and meowed at Ugly Duckling. Night was also a kitten, but it was a lot bigger than Ugly Duckling. It was a female kitten that was at least 3 or 4 months old. However, due to its malnutrition, it looked very thin and frail. Compared to the chubby Ugly Duckling, it was about the same size. Ugly Duckling immediately shrank behind Amy and looked at Night with a nervous expression, seemingly a little scared. "Ugly Duckling, you're so timid. If you keep acting like this, then don't tell anyone that you're my duck." Amy pouted as she looked at Ugly Duckling with a serious expression. "Meow." Ugly Duckling looked at Amy with an aggrieved expression before reluctantly making its way out from behind her. "Meow." Night meowed at Ugly Duckling again before taking a tentative step forward. "Meow." Ugly Duckling looked up at Amy and didn't dare to take another step back. However, it didn't dare to take another step forward either as it looked at Night. In a panic, it lay down on the ground before rolling around and wagging its little tail as a gesture of goodwill. "That's so embarrassing. I've never had a duck like you." Chapter 783. Because of the two little ones, their reunion on this rainy night became a lot more relaxing and heartwarming. The warm yellow lights seemed to have completely blocked out the cold and torrential rain outside. Meg walked along the corridor and found a secluded corner to change his clothes. He returned to his room and closed the window. He looked at the mother and daughter who were still encouraging the two kittens to fight each other, and picked up a small knife. He cut off 3 pieces of ice cream cake and placed them on a small plate. After that, he cut off 2 smaller pieces of cake and placed them on another small plate. "Have some ice cream cake. It's going to melt soon." Meg handed the ice cream cake to Amy and Irina. Ugly Duckling immediately withdrew its gaze from Night and looked up at Meg with an aggrieved expression. It was about to eat the ice cream cake, but it was crushed by Meg's foot. The more it thought about it, the more aggrieved it felt. Night was also looking up at Meg with a curious expression. It didn't know what that was, but it was still curious about everything. Meg was a little embarrassed by Ugly Duckling's aggrieved expression. After all, he was the one who had crushed its cake. He placed 2 small plates in front of Ugly Duckling and Night with a smile, and said, "This is for you." "Meow, meow." An excited look appeared on Ugly Duckling's face again. It leaned over to the ice cream cake and took a sniff. It then licked the ice cream with its little tongue, and its eyes immediately narrowed with a blissful expression. "Meow." Night looked at Ugly Duckling licking the ice cream cake with a curious expression. It then looked at the ice cream cake in front of it, and a sweet aroma wafted toward it. This was an aroma that it had never smelled before, and its eyes immediately lit up. After a moment of hesitation, it also stuck out its little tongue and licked the ice cream like Ugly Duckling did. The icy cold sensation immediately made it retract its tongue. It was given a fright and fell over, and it stared at the cake with a dumbstruck expression. However, aside from the icy cold sensation, the fragrant strawberry ice cream melted on the tip of its tongue, giving it a delicious experience that it had never experienced before, and its eyes lit up again. It stared at the ice cream cake for a moment before taking a glance at Ugly Duckling, which was licking the ice cream one mouthful after another. In the end, Night couldn't help but slowly make its way over to the ice cream cake and try to lick it again. On this occasion, the icy cold sensation didn't make it retreat in horror. Instead, it squatted down in front of the plate and licked the ice cream cake with elation just like Ugly Duckling. Ice cream cake. Irina took the small plate and looked at the delicate-looking cake that was cut into a triangular shape. The pink ice cream covered the top and sides of the cake, and she could see the distinct layers of the cake through the smooth cut. The creamy yellow cake and pink ice cream looked so adorable and intricate. Half a strawberry adorned the top of the cake, and the aroma of the strawberry and cake wafted toward her. Just the sight of it made her salivate. That's right. Father and Amy spent the entire afternoon making it. It's a super delicious ice cream cake, and only big sister Irina gets to eat it. Amy nodded as she placed the plate on the table beside her. She then scooped up a slice of cake with a small spoon, and put it into her mouth. Her eyebrows immediately curved into crescents, and a blissful expression appeared on her little face. She swayed her body from side to side in a very adorable manner. Little girl. A smile appeared on Irina's face at the sight of Amy's adorable expression. She then looked at the ice cream cake in her hand, and an expectant look appeared in her eyes. This was a cake made by the two most important people in her life. It had been 3 years, and she hadn't stopped thinking about them. Now that she was finally reunited with them, this was a very special feeling. Eat it. Meg was also looking at Irina with a gentle expression, but he was feeling a little uneasy. Even though he had made ice cream cake countless times in the test field for the god of cookery, this was the first time he had made it in the real world. Furthermore, he had made it with Amy, so he didn't know if Irina would like it. He didn't know if she liked desserts. Then I'll give it a try. Irina nodded and picked up a spoon. She copied Amy's actions and scooped up a spoonful of cake, which she then slowly put into her mouth. As soon as the cake entered her mouth, Irina's eyes lit up. The strawberry-flavored ice cream melted slowly on the tip of her tongue along with a sweet, milky aroma. The smooth, icy texture was imbued with a sweet flavor. Immediately afterward, the fragrant, creamy mousse cake took the stage. The soft texture was released along with the milky aroma, and it was like the perfect combination of ice and fire, bringing an unparalleled delicious experience to the tip of her tongue. Irina felt as if she had suddenly found a small yellow flower in full bloom on a snowy grassland. That feeling of elation was exactly what she was feeling right now. After swallowing, the strawberry-flavored milky aroma lingered on the tip of her tongue, and she waited for the next mouthful of ice cream. What a delicious dessert! Irina couldn't help but praise. She looked at the cake in her hand, which was missing a corner, and then turned to Ma Chong with a glint in her eyes. Her favorite desserts were all types of desserts. Those desserts exuded a sweet and blissful aroma that could bring her a good mood. Back when she had traveled to the Norland continent, her biggest motivation aside from wanting to explore the outside world was actually to go to other places outside of the Wind Forest to try other delicacies and desserts. However, after traveling to so many places and tasting all types of desserts, none of them could compare to this small piece of ice cream cake. It turned out that the thing that she had been searching for had always been by her side. Say, you didn't intentionally hide the fact that you could cook from me back then, did you? Irina appraised Meg with an appraising expression. It had only been 3 years since they last met, but he had already created such a delicious dessert. The unique flavor and texture were something that she had never seen before. This is probably what it means to be a natural talent. Meg shrugged, and the smile on his face gradually widened. It appeared that she was very satisfied and fond of this dish. We'll talk more about your natural talent in the future. Irina clearly didn't believe Meg's words, but there was a hint of joy in her eyes. She scooped up another spoonful of ice cream with a blissful smile on her face. Has father and big sister Irina already made a breakthrough? Amy looked at the two of them with a curious expression before blinking at Meg with curiosity in her big blue eyes. Chapter 784. It's the 4th day since Mr. Mac left. I miss him. Harrison sat on the steps in front of Mamie's. He stared blankly at the starry sky as if all his energy had been sucked out of him. Mr. Mac isn't dead. Why are you acting like this? George threw a small wine flask in his hand and sat down beside him. He sighed. Speaking of which, I really do miss him. You're even more mushy. I'm getting goosebumps. Harrison moved his butt to the side in disdain, trying to get away from him. You don't know. I'm not the only one who misses Mr. Mac. Everyone in the family is like him. Can you imagine waking up to my wife and a bunch of kids looking at me expectantly, asking me if Mr. Mac is back? How do you feel? I can't wait to run to Rodu and ask Mr. Mac to make me a plate of Yangzhou fried rice for my wife. She really hasn't had a good meal for days. George looked a little worried and helpless. Harrison patted George on the shoulder before handing him the opened wine flask again with a sympathetic expression as he consoled, Don't worry, Boss Mag will be back soon. Sigh. George took a sip of the wine before handing it over again. He got up and patted his clothes with a smile as he said, All right, I have to go back now. The little ones must be pestering my wife again when I'm not at home. The doctor said that she's going to give birth in a few days. Harrison's eyes lit up. Looks like I'll have another godson, he said with a smile. George's face darkened immediately. Daughter. Godson. Harrison smiled awkwardly. It has to be a daughter this time. George said firmly. He waved at Harrison and turned to get into the carriage. Harrison looked at the carriage that was driving away. He scratched his head and muttered to himself, based on probability, it's very difficult. There's no need to look. Mr. Mac isn't back yet. He won't be back tomorrow either. Harrison said loudly as he looked at the two young ladies who were excitedly walking over from not far away. Seeing the smiles on their faces gradually disappear, and seeing the resentment in their eyes, Harrison suddenly felt much better. He got into his own carriage and left. On the rooftop balcony of Amy's building, 3 figures were lying down and looking at the sky. Due to the difference in height, it was like a scale that was gradually increasing in height. Mia, when will Amy and the others come back? Barbara asked softly as she looked at the moon in the sky. The boss said that he will be back in 5 days. According to the time, he should be back the day after tomorrow. Mia thought and said. What about Sister Aisha? When will she be back? Anna turned to look at Mia, a little worried. Aisha didn't say where she was going, but she said she would come back. Mia shook her head slightly. Thinking of what Aisha said that day, she was also a little worried. However, seeing Anna's expression, she smiled and said, when the boss comes back, the restaurant will be open for business. Aisha will definitely come back. Okay. Anna nodded. Although she was still a little worried, she didn't continue to ask. The 3 of them were silent for a while. I really want to eat beef kebabs. Barbara broke the silence. I also want to eat rujiamo. Yabamiya swallowed her saliva. Anna thought for a while, and said softly, I want to eat Yangzhou fried rice. Rumble, someone's stomach growled first. Without roast fish, I'm going to die of boredom. Vivian sat on the rooftop of the city lord's castle. Her long legs dangled outside, and she was a little bored. She supported herself with her hands behind her back and looked up at the sky. Not only did Mr. Mac go to Rodu, he even kidnapped Luna. Now I'm even more bored. After a while, Vivian sighed again with a hint of resentment in her voice. They'll be back the day after tomorrow. Mr. Mac won the Best Dish Award at the Royal Banquet today. A voice with a hint of laughter sounded from below. Vivian looked down to find City Lord Michael standing below with his hands clasped behind his back with a smile on his face. Really? Is Mr. Mac really that good? Vivian jumped down from the rooftop and looked at Michael with incredulity. He had also attended royal banquets in the Roth Empire when he was a child. There were countless tables and chairs in the Grand Palace, and all of them were filled with all types of delicious food. God knew how many chefs were required to cook so many delicious dishes. Among all of them, Mr. Mac's dish was able to stand out and win the Best Dish Award. It was simply incredible. But Mr. Mac won the Best Dish Award at the royal banquet. Will King Roth keep him in Rodu? Vivian suddenly thought of something, and was a little concerned. If Mr. Mac was kept in Rodu, then she wouldn't be able to eat spicy grilled fish in the future. Her illness had been suppressed by the spicy grilled fish that she had been eating non-stop during this period of time. Even though she had stopped eating spicy grilled fish for a few days, there were no signs of her illness relapsing. According to the doctor, most of the root cause of her illness had already been eradicated. All she had to do now was continue to eat spicy grilled fish, and the root cause of her illness would be completely eradicated. Of course, even if she recovered from her illness, Vivian was afraid that she wouldn't be able to quit eating spicy grilled fish as it was simply too delicious. Michael shook his head with a smile and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Mac rejected King Roth's invitation to stay, and the principal will bring him back. Mr. Mac is a rare talent." "That's good to hear." Wei Wei was immediately relieved. "Young mistress, due to the addition of tailors, the custom-made dresses have basically been completed, and we're in the final stages of refinement. The progress of the other two dresses is also faster than expected. According to our calculations, we should be able to order more dresses." The lights in the blue suede were still brightly lit, and Mars quickly strode into Gloria's office as he spoke. "No, the number of dresses won't change, but the quality of all of them has to be guaranteed to be the highest." Gloria thought for a moment before shaking her head. "However, if the tailors have some spare time, we can make more of the other two dresses." "All right." Mars nodded with a smile at Gloria before departing. His young mistress was on her way to becoming a successful businesswoman. "Mr. Meg is coming back the day after tomorrow. Perhaps I can ask him some questions. Besides, I'll finally be able to see him again." Gloria rose to her feet and stretched lazily by the window. She couldn't help but blush at the thought of that. "Big sister Irina, do you want to marry father after eating this cake?" Chapter 785. Meg raised an eyebrow as he cleared away the dishes. He looked up at Irina with a calm expression. Amy's question was very in-depth and professional. Setting aside everything else, she was only asking if she wanted to marry him because of this piece of cake. A chef who could evoke the urge to marry someone through a single dish was definitely a successful chef. Of course, such a woman could already form a long line outside Amy's. However, Irina was different, and even Meg couldn't help but be curious about her. However, as soon as Meg looked up, he was greeted by the sight of Irina's smiling eyes. She licked off a bit of ice cream from the corner of her lips, and there was a hint of seduction in her clear blue eyes as she looked at Meg. "I heard that your mother is the most beautiful woman in the world. Even if I want to marry him, I don't know if he'd dare to do so. This woman is a little scary, and she's also a little narcissistic. Time to go." Meg felt like he was prey that had been targeted by a cheetah, and he suddenly lowered his eyes in fear. Is Amy's mother really the most beautiful woman in the world? Amy's eyes immediately lit up. Yes, she's tied with me for number one. She's the only woman who can match me. Irina nodded. Wow, Big Sister Irina is the most beautiful fairy I've ever seen. If Big Sister Irina is as beautiful as Big Sister Irina, then my mother must be super beautiful. Little stars lit up in Amy's eyes, and the hazy figure in her dream gradually became clearer as it transformed into Irina's appearance. In all of her imaginations, this was the most intimate and beautiful appearance she had ever seen. Of course, Irina replied in a matter-of-fact manner. Amy immediately clapped her little hands. Then father is so lucky to be able to marry two of the most beautiful women in the world at the same time. But does he have the guts to marry another woman? Irina looked at Meg with a smile, but there was a hint of danger in her smile. Meg slowly turned his head away. Even if he had the intention to do so, he didn't have the guts to do so. Moreover, the two most beautiful women in the world were actually Irina. What was going on? Father sure is bold. Amy shook her head and turned to look at Meg. Father, don't you agree? Come, have another piece of cake. Meg placed the two pieces of cake in front of the two of them and smiled as he changed the topic. Yeah, he's got a lot of guts. Irina glanced at Meg with an ambiguous smile, but she still picked up the spoon and continued to eat the cake. Meg wiped the cold sweat off his forehead without batting an eyelid. What kind of sin had he committed? It was obviously nothing, but he suddenly felt like he was suffering from bronchitis. Could it be that fate had grabbed him by the throat? Meg suddenly felt some fear towards Irina in the future. But this feeling of being teased so openly, as if they were dancing on a string, made him feel a little strange. This was a feeling he had never felt with any woman before. It was obviously a little uncomfortable, but he didn't feel much resistance in his heart. He even felt a little expectant. Could it be that I'm a masochist? Meg questioned himself. According to the definition of the word masochist, a masochist is a type of person with masochistic tendencies, the exact opposite of a sadist. According to the system's analysis, the other party's behavior obviously creates pressure and some level of mental abuse for the host. Although the host's body shows a certain degree of resistance, the host is looking forward to it mentally. This behavior pattern only appears when interacting with Irina. According to the system's comprehensive analysis, the host is a hidden masochist, and the host is selective. At this moment, the system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. System, can't you research something more interesting? Meg roared in a flustered and exasperated manner. The host's abnormal behavior is an attempt to hide the awkwardness of having his inner thoughts exposed. However, this behavior confirms the system's analysis. Host, you're a masochist. The system calmly said. Scram. Meg looked at Irina, who was eating the cake, with complicated feelings. Although he was against the system's analysis, he couldn't help but face it head-on. What kind of charm did this woman have to make him behave so strangely? Even though she was already Amy's mother, Irina, who was eating the ice cream cake with an unpretentious smile on her face, was still like a young girl, giving people a sense of youthfulness. Even though she had experienced so many things, you couldn't see the slightest trace of the vicissitudes of life on her face. That kind of vitality and innocence seemed to be infectious, making people unconsciously want to get close to her. Perhaps her beauty was unforgettable, but what Meg saw was an interesting soul, and that was what really interested him. The entire delicious cake was devoured by the three of them and the two cats. Ugly Duckling rolled over on the ground before slowly inching toward Night. It arrived in front of it, and suddenly got up to pounce on it. Right at this moment, Night suddenly extended a little black paw and pressed it against Ugly Duckling's head. Ugly Duckling immediately cowered. It was pressed to the ground by Knight's paw, and it didn't dare to move. It looked at Amy with an aggrieved expression, but didn't dare to cry for help. "This is a very delicious cake." Irina placed the empty plate on the table gently as she looked at Meg. Meg nodded with a smile. It naturally felt very good to be praised. Irina turned to Amy with a smile and said, "Amy, I'm going to leave Rhodey soon. Is there anything you want? I can give it to you as a gift." "Anything I want." Amy looked at Irina and thought carefully for a while before saying, "Can I have big sister Irina hug me for a while longer? Just like a mother would hug me." Irina looked at Amy, who was staring at her with big, watery eyes, and suddenly felt a lump in her throat. She squatted down and gently picked up Amy in her arms as she said in a gentle voice, "I also want to hug you like this every day. Big sister Irina is the best." Amy closed her eyes and inhaled the faint floral fragrance as she lay in Irina's soft and comfortable embrace, and soon fell asleep. In her sleep, the woman under the tree on the moon finally turned around. There was a smile on her exquisitely beautiful face, and she slowly made her way toward her before embracing her in a warm embrace. A smile appeared on Amy's face as she murmured, "Mother." Chapter 786. For a split second, Meg had the urge to keep her. Just like that, their family of 3 could live a carefree life, and that seemed pretty good too. Looking at Amy, who was lying in Irina's arms with a smile on her face even in her sleep, he suddenly understood the meaning of the phrase, "A family should be complete." He used to think that he could give Amy the most love in the world and let her grow up happily. But he had to admit that motherly love was something that he could never give Amy, and it was also something that she couldn't live without. "I'll make sure that the time we spend together becomes shorter." Meg secretly made up his mind. There were many things that needed to be put on the agenda as soon as possible. Irina hugged Amy and gently rocked her back and forth as she hummed a gentle song. It was a soft fairy song, and it sounded like a natural chant. Although they couldn't understand it, it still made their hearts feel at peace. What a wonderful feeling. That ugly little fellow from back then has grown up into a beautiful and mischievous girl. She even knows how to call me mother. Even though she doesn't know who I am, she knows how to get close to me. What a smart little fellow. If only she could stay by your side forever. Irina hugged Amy for a long time. When the singing stopped, she reluctantly looked away from Amy's little face and looked up at Meg. She asked, "When will you come and pick me up?" Meg looked into Irina's clear eyes and thought seriously for a while before saying firmly, "1 year." "Okay, then I'll wait for you for a year. If you don't come and pick me up in a year, then I'll come and pick you up." Irina nodded and handed Amy to Meg. She leaned over and kissed her on the eyes. She looked into Meg's eyes for a long time before suddenly standing on her tiptoes and kissing his cheek. "Meg, remember this, you're my man, Irina." A faint golden teleportation formation lit up, and Irina and Knight disappeared at the same time. Only a dumbstruck Meg was left in the room with Amy in his arms, as well as Ugly Duckling, who was also lying on the ground with a dumbstruck expression. Only after a long while did Meg come to his senses. He reached out to touch his cheek and blinked, but he was still a little stunned. When those soft lips were pressed against his cheek, his mind had almost completely gone blank. Even though she didn't say anything threatening, that one sentence was more than countless threats. Meg sighed. It wasn't easy being Irina's man, and from this day onward, he would have to bear this pressure. 1 year was the promise that Meg had made to both Irina and Amy. Meg didn't want to delay their reunion for too long. What he had to do next was to do everything in his power to go to the Wind Forest to pick up Irina. After all, he didn't want to be picked up by Irina and brought back to the Wind Forest in a year's time. Living off a woman was a skill, but Meg didn't want to be looked down upon by Amy. He had to ride the rainbow cloud to the wind forest to pick up Irina. Looking at Amy in his arms, Meg's expression gradually softened. As long as she was happy, he would do anything. This is. Meg's gaze landed on a small green string that suddenly appeared on Amy's wrist. There was a green bead about the size of a soybean tied to the string. It also looked like a seed. It was translucent and emitted a faint green light. This bead should have been left behind by Irina. Meg was very familiar with this green light. It was the same light green light that was emitted from Irina's hand when she saved him today. It was full of vitality. Even though I don't know what it is, it must be something precious. Meg pulled Amy's sleeve down a little to cover the bead. Then, he wrapped Amy with his own clothes. Then, he squatted down to pick up Ugly Duckling, who was still lying on the ground, and pushed the door open. The storm had subsided a lot, but the rain was still pouring down heavily. Master Meg, are you going back? Let me hold an umbrella for you. The butler, who had fallen asleep leaning against the railing, opened his eyes when he heard the sound. When he saw Meg, he quickly went up to him with a smile. Then I'll have to trouble you. Meg nodded with a smile. He naturally couldn't miss out on such a perfect alibi. Furthermore, he really didn't have the time to hold an umbrella. After exiting the kitchen, he hadn't walked far when a burst of noise sounded from not far away. It was mixed with Josh's scolding and smashing sounds. What's that? Meg was a little perplexed. Maybe one of the servants did something wrong. The butler looked in that direction and shrank back. He was secretly glad that he had been given an easy task today, but he didn't dare to say anything. Meg nodded slightly and didn't ask any questions. He was just a little disappointed that he hadn't been able to kill Josh with a single sword strike. After returning to the room, Meg carefully placed Amy on the bed. He looked at the little one's adorable face with a smile, and couldn't help but lean over and kiss her forehead. Alex is back. Rodu should be in chaos now. Meg looked out the window at the chrysanthemums swaying in the rain. Piss off. Piss off, all of you. Josh was completely drenched, and his hair was disheveled. He kicked down a servant who was kneeling on the ground with a hot towel in his hands as he yelled at the top of his lungs. Everything in the room was overturned. Precious porcelain bottles and jade stones were smashed into pieces. It was a complete mess as far as the eye could see. The dozen or so servants who were kneeling on the ground hurriedly rushed out of the room as if they had been pardoned. Josh was soon the only one left in the room after the door was closed. Josh staggered over to the table and supported himself with both hands as he sat down in a chair in a daze with a hollow look in his eyes. Right at this moment, a burst of blue light lit up in the room, and Richard emerged from the teleportation formation. His brows furrowed slightly at the sight of Josh, who was sitting there as if his soul had been sucked out of his body. He said in a grim voice, "Your Highness, Alex has reappeared, and he's at the peak of his powers. If he reveals what happened 3 years ago to the public, we're going to be under immense pressure. We have to make some preparations." Josh only came to his senses after hearing that voice. He looked at Richard, and his lips trembled as his face paled slightly. He wanted to kill me. His sword slashed across my neck, and I almost died. Richard took a glance at the wound on Josh's neck, and a serious expression appeared on his face as he said, "Your Highness, we'll protect you." Chapter 787. In a spacious courtyard to the west of Rodu, a golden teleportation spell formation appeared, and Irina slowly made her way out of it. A few lights were lit up in the inky black room, and soon, several elves emerged from their rooms with wary expressions. All of them were surprised to see Irina, and they hurriedly extended respectful salutes. "Your Highness. I need to use the teleportation spell formation to return to the Wind Forest." Irina looked at the white-haired old elf with a calm expression. The battle outside the wind forest was drawing to a conclusion. A massive icicle was impaled into the chest of a tall demon, pinning him to a large tree. At the same time, Sally, who was standing on a tree branch in the distance, was also struck in the stomach by half a shield, and she fell from the tree branch with a dull thump. Blower had a broken sword embedded in his chest, and he was stumbling towards Sally. Blood was gushing out of his wounds, and his pale face appeared to be extremely feeble, as if he were going to collapse at any moment. However, he still continued to make his way towards Sally with determination. A dozen or so demon and orc corpses were strewn all over the ground, and the elves who had their hands and feet bound were squatting on the ground with horrified expressions. They leaned against each other with their heads bowed, and there were even children sobbing. Ever since they had been captured by these people, they had been subjected to countless torments. They knew that this kind of torture wouldn't stop after coming to the wind forest. Instead, it would only intensify. Being tortured by elves was even more torturous than being tortured by demons and orcs. However, their escort team had already arrived outside the wind forest, so how had they suddenly been ambushed? They were only suffering because of their brethren, so none of them dared to hope that someone would save them. They're all dead. An elf exclaimed in shock as he removed the rag from his mouth. All of the elves raised their heads upon hearing that, and their eyes immediately lit up at the sight of their most hated enemies lying in pools of blood. Could it be that they're here to save us? The elf from before looked at the motionless Sally and the struggling Blower with a perplexed expression. If they were the elves responsible for the trade, they definitely wouldn't attack these orcs and demons, nor would they risk their lives to ambush them. Are you still alive? Blower panted heavily as he leaned against a tree for support. He looked at Sally, who was lying on the ground with blood dripping from the corners of her lips. Cough. Cough, cough. Sally, who had been lying on the ground this entire time, suddenly coughed violently as she sat up, and threw up a mouthful of blood. She then turned to Blower with furrowed brows, and feebly asked, "Are you a man or a woman? Is that important?" Blower rolled his eyes, but he was quite relieved to see that Sally wasn't going to die from this ordeal. He heaved a sigh of relief, and his feeble body finally gave out as he sat down onto the ground. The wound on his chest had been torn open, and even more blood was flowing out. His brows furrowed tightly with pain. A streak of green light appeared on Sally's fingertips, and she gently rubbed it over her lower abdomen. The wound caused by the shield stopped bleeding. Her internal injuries couldn't be healed in a short period of time, but it was enough for her to move normally. Sally slowly stood up and made her way over to Blower as she said, "If you were a woman, then I wouldn't have to think of a way to annul the engagement." Blower looked up at Sally, and forced a smile onto his face as he said, "You don't have to worry about that, I don't have any feelings for you." "Very good." Sally nodded before grabbing onto the broken sword embedded in Blower's chest. "What are you doing?" Blower's voice suddenly rose an octave. "I'm going to pull it out for you," Sally replied in an indifferent voice. "You're going to kill me if you pull it out like that." A hint of horror appeared in Blower's eyes. This woman was way too terrifying. Could it be that he had hurt her with his words? "Well, I actually think you're a pretty good woman. It's just that I'm not interested in the wind forest." Arg! Before Blower had a chance to finish his sentence, a sharp cry erupted, scaring away all of the birds that had just landed nearby. Blower looked down at the frozen wound on his chest, and the wisps of green light that were seeping into the wound. His face was still as pale as a sheet of paper from extreme shock. Is this woman a demon? Blower looked up at the expressionless Sally, and his heart shuddered. Even though he had been saved, he still instinctively wanted to distance himself from her. Not only was this woman capable of accurate swordsmanship and powerful magic, she was also capable of killing without batting an eyelid. If you don't want to be taken back like this, then eat this and get ready to go. Sally tossed her blood-stained broken sword to the side, and a gentle wash of water flowed over her hand. She flipped her hand over to produce a small green box, and poured out a small green pill from within before handing it to Blower. All right. Blower looked down at himself before popping the small pill into his mouth. He then propped himself up against a tree beside him. Even though they had ambushed the escort team outside the Wind Forest, the elves who had been waiting for the escort team to arrive were most likely going to get here very soon. If he were to be taken back while dressed as a woman, he would most likely have his legs broken by his father. Sally made her way over to the elves. She raised a hand, and a small ice blade sliced through the elves, slicing through the vines and magic binding ropes binding them. She looked at the elves, and said in a gentle voice, "Don't be afraid, we're here to save you." After regaining their freedom, the elves pulled out the rags that had been stuffed into their mouths. They looked down at their hands, which were no longer bound. The vines had almost sunk into their flesh, leaving behind 2 deep gashes. After a moment of silence, some of the elves suddenly began to sob. The sobbing became louder and louder, and almost all of the elves were weeping. The smile on Sally's face gradually disappeared. She looked at the sobbing elves, and felt as if her heart had been constricted. She had once thought that the Wind Forest was the most perfect place in the world, and that all of the elves who lived there lived carefree lives. They enjoyed the service of their elven servants, and they felt that they were all happy as well. However, all of that had now been shattered, as if a beautiful crystal window had been shattered by a hammer, revealing all of the filth behind it. It was a ghastly sight. Blower stood beside Sally with a complex expression on his face. However, he still yelled, "Let's go, it's time for us to go." The sobbing of the elves gradually subsided, and they bowed deeply to Blower and Sally. They took one last look at the Wind Forest, which they had once viewed as a holy land, but now, it had become a living hell that they didn't dare to take even a single step into, and they began to depart in the opposite direction. "How dare you!" Chapter 788. Within the darkness, several tens of black-robed elves surrounded them, pointing their sharp arrows at Sally, Blower, and the other elves. The leader of the group was a middle-aged elf with a square face. Compared to the elves who were generally more handsome, this elf was quite eye-catching. He swept his sharp gaze over the corpses on the ground and the terrified elves before finally settling on Sally and Blower. The elf on the left was a little disheveled, but her tattered dress still couldn't hide her beauty. However, he didn't recall seeing such a beautiful young girl among the elves. The elf on the right had a black veil over her face, so he couldn't see her features clearly in the darkness, but judging from her figure and eyes, she was most likely a young girl as well. There were many orc and demon corpses on the ground, and many of them were at the 6th or 7th tier. They were the first batch of elves to be escorted here, but they were all killed. From the looks of it, these 2 young girls were most likely responsible. Seeing as they weren't elves from the Wind Forest, and dared to ambush the escorts, these 2 had to be one of those so-called free elves who dared to do something so audacious. But these 2 young girls are quite beautiful and have great figures. If I give them to Master Boris, he'll definitely like them. Colby looked at Sally and Blower. They appeared to have been injured in the previous battle, so this was a good opportunity to capture them. He waved a hand and said, "Capture them. Kill anyone who dares to resist." Despair appeared on the faces of the elves who had just regained their freedom. They looked at the menacing arrows, and couldn't muster up any thoughts of resistance. They stood rooted to the spot, waiting for their brethren to tie them up again and enslave them. Colby, an 8th-tier wood-type magic caster. "I can't beat him, but I'll try my best to hold him off." "You take as many as you can," Blower said softly to Colby. "I'll hold him off, and you take them away." Sally, who had put on her black veil, turned to Blower, and said, "If you're captured like this, the news that the third young master of the Billy family is a freak will spread throughout the entire The Wind Forest tomorrow. I am who I am. I am not a pervert, and I will not change because of what others say." A smile appeared on Blower's face as he looked at Sally. "But you could be the future hope of the elven race, the hope of freedom." As soon as he said that, the seemingly feeble Blower suddenly burst forth with astonishing speed and power as he dashed toward Colby. Light glowed on his wand, and it transformed into a series of wooden arrows that flew toward Colby. "Heh, you still dare to attack me?" Colby looked at Blower with disdain. He raised his hand, and a thick wooden shield appeared in front of him. The wooden arrows landed on the wooden shield, but they didn't cause any damage to it. As Blower continued onward, the branches of the surrounding trees seemed to have sprung to life as they lashed toward Blower like whips. They were traveling at an astonishing speed, and the sound of the air being torn apart rang out as they flew through the air. Countless vines extended from beneath Colby's feet toward Blower and the other elves like a swarm of green vipers. Sally took a glance at Blower, and for the first time, a different light appeared in her eyes. She stepped onto a nearby tree trunk, and her agile body traversed through the forest like a cheetah. She picked up two little elves from the group of elves on either side of her, then turned around and ran in the opposite direction. "Don't let her get away. Fire the arrows." An elf yelled as a series of arrows rained down toward Sally's back. Sally darted through the trees like an elf, and the arrows barely passed by her before embedding themselves deeply into the tree trunks. However, her speed was clearly slowing down. The two little elves that she was carrying looked at her with horror on their faces, but they didn't cry. Whoosh! A flaming arrow hurtled through the air, but its target wasn't Sally. Instead, it was the little elf that she was carrying in her left hand. Elves were a race that excelled at hunting, and they had all mastered superb archery techniques. This arrow was more powerful and faster than the previous ones, and it was able to accurately determine Sally's trajectory. Sally's expression immediately changed. This was clearly a seasoned hunter who had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to unleash a lethal attack. His footsteps were forced to stop, and the foot that landed on the tree trunk forced his body to turn sideways as he moved forward, changing the position of the little elf. The arrow whistled through the air, leaving a deep gash in her back. It then pierced through 3 trees in quick succession before embedding itself into the 4th one. The immense force imbued within the arrow made Sally stumble, and she almost fell to the ground. The barrage of arrows that were hurtling toward her made it impossible for her to continue onward. The elves slowly surrounded her, and the wands in their hands began to glow. There was no lack of 6th and 7th tier magic casters among them. "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I won't be able to take you with me today." Sally stopped in her tracks and gently placed the 2 little elves onto the ground. Tears shone in her eyes as she gripped her wand tightly. The little elf girl extended her little hand and touched Sally's hand. She looked up with a serious expression and said, "Big sister killed the bad guys who killed our parents. Thank you. They killed my grandpa. Thank you." The little elf boy also looked up with gratitude. Sally looked down at the 2 little elves, and her tears began to flow down her cheeks uncontrollably. Blower had evaded many branches, and unleashed an advanced spell with all his might, but he was still unable to break through Kobol's defenses. He was bound tightly by the vines, and hung upside down from a large tree. The elves were also bound by the vines, and their eyes were filled with despair. They didn't struggle, nor did they cry. It was as if they had already died. The barrage of spells was blocked by Sally's magic barrier. However, the magic barrier that was getting thinner and thinner still couldn't withstand the barrage of attacks. After it was destroyed, the exhausted Sally and the 2 little elves were also bound by the vines, and dragged into the midst of the elves. Kobol walked forward, and looked down at the elves with a condescending expression as he said, "All of you were born to be inferior to the elves in the crazy forest, and are destined to become slaves. If you dare to resist, only death awaits you. There are classes in this world, and all of you belong to the lowest class." The elves held Kobold down with hatred in their eyes, but more than that, they were resigned to their fate and in despair. In this world, no one could save them because all the elves in the forest had silently agreed to this, including the Elven Queen. Who's farting here? Chapter 789. It wasn't always a pie that fell from the sky, it could also be a beautiful elf. Just as all of the captured elves were in despair, and Sally and Blower were doing their best to turn the tables, a figure descended from the sky and stomped the arrogant Colby into the ground. This was an exquisitely beautiful elf in a white robe. There was a small golden crescent moon on her glabella, and a faint golden light enshrouded her body. She was like a goddess who had descended from the heavens, striking onlookers with a sense of holiness. However, such a beautiful elf was stomping on Colby's face. Colby, who was an 8th-tier wood-type magic caster and had easily subdued Blower and all of the other elves, had half of his face stomped into the ground, and was completely immobilized. Could it be that she's here to save us? This scene was like a miracle in the eyes of all of the captured elves. They almost couldn't believe their eyes, and a hint of hope reappeared in their hearts. "Your Highness." Blower's eyes lit up, and he immediately heaved a sigh of relief. As long as she was here, everything would be fine. "Princess Irina." Sally's eyes also lit up at the sight of the elf who had suddenly descended from the sky, and a smile appeared on her tear-stained face. In the entire The Wind Forest, she was the only one they could rely on and trust. They just didn't think that she would really appear. The elf who had descended from the sky was Irina, who had just teleported back from Rodu. The teleportation spell formation of the Elven Embassy in Rodu required a large amount of spirit stones to activate, so it was rarely used. However, with Irina's status, it was naturally no issue for her to use it once. "Your Highness." All of the surrounding elves were shocked to see who had arrived, and all of them lowered their heads in salute toward Irina. They also hurriedly lowered the bows in their hands with nervous expressions. Just a few months ago, the princess came out of seclusion again, and killed Elder Hubert on the spot because of the elven slaves. The queen also issued a new order to ban all slaves and release the elves who wanted to leave the Wind Forest. But after that, Princess Irina was imprisoned again, and Her Majesty the Queen was also in seclusion. She didn't really manage the affairs of the clan. Therefore, after symbolically releasing some old, weak, sick, and disabled slaves, the major families didn't really carry out the law. As winter approached, more and more elves would be sent to the Wind Forest to supply the major families with fresh slaves and provide the border with young cannon fodder. All of the major families in the elven race were extremely powerful, and even with Schubert's example, all of them were still doing business with one another. However, that didn't mean that no one dared to ignore Irina. After all, she had dared to kill Schubert right in front of Mistress Helena and the Queen. Regardless of whether it was her power or her merciless personality, none of the major families dared to provoke her. Furthermore, the timing of this transaction just so happened to coincide with her trip to Rodu to celebrate the birthday of the King of the Roth Empire. According to the plan, she should still be in Rodu, but who would have thought that she would appear here? Horror began to well up in their hearts. "Your Highness." The bound elves faltered slightly upon hearing this, and they suddenly recalled some legends about Princess Irina. In this world, if there was one elf from the Wind Forest who was sympathetic toward them, then it had to be that kind-hearted princess. A few years ago, Princess Irina, who had traveled the continent with Alex, had almost wiped out all of the orc and demon mercenary squads that targeted wandering elves. Even those who had survived all gave up on attacking elves in fear that Princess Irina would come looking for them. Those were the safest years for wandering elves on the Norland continent. They didn't have to worry about demons and orcs suddenly appearing and capturing them. Even though not all elves had been saved by Princess Irina, all of them were grateful for everything she had done for them. She was like a savior who had saved them from the abyss of suffering. However, good times didn't last long. 3 years ago, Princess Irina stopped appearing, and the demons and orcs that were lurking in the shadows once again reached out their claws. The elves who resisted were killed, and the beautiful elves would become the slaves of some powerful beings on Rodu or Demon Island. Even more elves were sent back to the Wind Forest as lowly slaves. This was a never-ending disaster. Aside from a few powerful elves who had managed to escape, almost all of the elves scattered across the Norland continent had been killed. Only Chaos City had become the last safe haven for the free elves. However, in recent years, even the elves in Chaos City had begun to disappear from time to time. The elves were almost completely powerless in this disaster, and most of them had placed their hopes on Princess Irina. However, there had been no news of her since 3 years ago, and the elves were becoming more and more despaired. However, Princess Irina had appeared again, and stomped all of the elves who had attacked them into the ground in an extremely domineering manner. Hope reappeared in the elves' despairing eyes. If there was someone in this world who could save them from the Wind Forest, then it had to be Princess Irina. Elves are born equal. Who says they are inferior? Irina glanced at all the elves present before looking down at Colby, who had been stomped into the ground by her. She coldly said, "The Queen abolished the slave system a month ago. Who gave you the guts to continue colluding with these bastards to kidnap your own kind?" "Your Highness. I was only following orders." This was all Elder Diff's orders. Colby said with difficulty and fear as half of his face was sunk into the ground. Even Hubert's elder Irina dared to kill him on the spot. It would be very normal for her to kill him on the spot. He had only lived for less than half of the elves' long lifespan, and didn't want to die just like that. "Very well, I'll get even with him for this." Irina nodded coldly. She raised her right foot and stomped down again. Colby's head was completely sunk into the ground. He kicked his legs, and stopped moving. Chapter 790. She's back. In the starry cave abode, Helena looked toward the northwest with a hint of surprise in her eyes. However, she also heaved a sigh of relief. Then, she seemed to have thought of something, and her brows furrowed again. After pondering for a while, she shook her head and murmured to herself, "Those pieces of trash, Irina, it's good that you're all right." A smile appeared on the Elven Queen's face as she stood on the largest tree. She looked toward the northwest, and the smile on her face gradually disappeared. Perhaps I should let her go and do something. Perhaps I really did make a mistake back then. The Elven Queen stood on the tree for a long time before withdrawing her gaze. She slowly walked down the tree and disappeared into the tree hole. Irina is back. At the same time, some of the elves sensed the magic waves coming from outside the forest. Such powerful teleportation magic had already made some people guess who had returned. Many of them knew what was going to happen outside the Wind Forest today, and some of them were even the masterminds. However, Irina, who everyone thought would be trapped in Rodu forever, suddenly returned to the Wind Forest. This was undoubtedly beyond everyone's expectations. There were already elves gathering in the darkness. Aside from horror, the elves who were holding longbows also had a hint of shame on their faces. They lowered their heads and didn't dare to look at Irina directly. "Please spare us, Princess. We were only following orders." The longbow in one of the elves' hands fell to the ground, and he immediately knelt to the ground. "Please spare us, Princess." All of the elves knelt to the ground with fearful expressions. Irina swept her gaze across those elves, and the vines binding the elves in the center retreated. Then, the vines wrapped around those elves and tied them to the trees. Those elves who had regained their freedom sat on the ground, paralyzed. Regardless of whether it was Colby who had been killed on the spot or the elven warriors who had been tied up, everything was like a dream. They couldn't believe it. "I am Irina." Irina took 2 steps forward, and a look of pity appeared on her face as she looked at the elves who were riddled with wounds. She raised her hand gently, and a beam of green light rose up from the tree of life in the distance. The beam of green light surged toward her and circled around her body before flowing into the crowd of elves like a stream of water. Light green light brushed over the wounds of the elves, and the life force caused those wounds to quickly heal. Their bodies, which were almost skin and bones due to starvation and abuse, also recovered. Their pale faces regained some color, and their empty eyes seemed to have regained some luster due to the changes in their bodies. In the blink of an eye, all of the elves had received excellent treatment, as if they had been given a new lease of life. "Thank you, Your Highness." "Thank you." Elation appeared on the faces of the elves as they sensed the changes in their bodies. They bowed to Irina with tears of gratitude in their eyes. The 2 little elves in Sally's arms blushed slightly as they stood up from Sally's arms. They each extended a little hand to help Sally up, and elated smiles appeared on their little faces as they said, "Big sister, Her Highness is here to save us." "Yes, Her Highness saved us." Sally nodded as she looked at Irina with reverence in her eyes. "In the future, I'm going to become an elf like you and fight for all elves." "Sure, can you put me down first?" Blower asked in a quiet voice. Even though he had also been treated, he was still hanging from the tree, and it was a little awkward for him. Sally raised a finger, and a blade of ice sliced through the vines on Blower's body. Blower fell from the tree, and just barely managed to land on his knees before his head hit the ground. He then knelt down in front of Irina. "There's no need to thank me. I only did what I had to do." Irina shook her head. She looked at Blower, then at Sally, and nodded as she said, "Go on. Go to Chaos City. That's the only safe place now. Someone will take you there, and no one will chase you down." Blower stood up with an awkward expression, and he couldn't help but rub his own knees. He took a glance at Irina before turning around, and yelling, "Come with me, everyone, I'll take you to Chaos City." The elves bowed to Irina with gratitude in their eyes again before following Blower south. Chaos City was an unfamiliar place to them, but it was indeed their last safe haven. At the very least, no mercenary squad would dare to openly capture elves there. Sally looked at Irina, and her mouth gaped open, but she refrained from saying anything in the end. She took one final glance at Irina before quickly following the group. Irina's promise meant that they would be able to safely take these elves back to Chaos City. If she said that no one would chase them down, then no one would dare to chase them down. The group of several dozen elves traversed through the inky black forest. Blower was leading the way with a torch in his hand, illuminating the dark path ahead. All of the elves' eyes were filled with hope. It was as if they had finally found a path to sunlight in the boundless darkness. Irina looked on as the torch disappeared into the depths of the forest. She then slowly turned to look in the direction of the wind forest, and stood there in silence. The wind forest was also completely silent, as if no one knew what was going on outside. That night, countless people on the Norland continent were unable to sleep. However, Meg slept very well. When he opened his eyes, the warm morning sun shone through the unlatched window onto his bed. It was as if the storm from the night before had been nothing more than a dream. He turned to look at Amy, who was sleeping soundly in his arms, and a smile appeared on Meg's face. As long as he could see Amy smile every day when he woke up, everything would be fine. After Amy woke up naturally, Meg got up and helped her into a beautiful white dress. "Father, where's big sister Irina? Has she already left?" Amy looked around with a hint of disappointment on her little face. Yes. She left after putting Amy to sleep last night. We'll see her again in the future. Meg smiled as he patted Amy's head. I thought she would stay the night here. Amy heaved a forlorn sigh. She looked up at Meg and scolded him like a little adult. Father, why didn't you seize the opportunity? Meg's expression darkened upon hearing this. What was going on in this little girl's head? Was she trying to help her parents? All right, we have to go and participate in today's decimal system debate competition. Teacher Luna is going to be very worried. Meg changed the subject as he held Amy's little hand and led her out the door. Father, when will we be able to see big sister Irina again? Amy asked as she raised her head. Chapter 791. A new day had arrived in Rodu, and many people were beginning to reassess the situation due to Alex's appearance. Even though the details of the battle the night before hadn't been revealed, the fact that the second prince had just so happened to appear at the scene was still quite intriguing. Back when news of Alex's assassination spread, the king had personally announced the cause of his death, and executed several orcs and demons, but there were still many conspiracy theories about him. Alex had reappeared the night before, and Josh just so happened to be related to him. There were even rumors that he had sparred with Alex, so this was naturally very intriguing news. There was already a delicate balance between Josh and Sean, and as long as the king didn't express his stance, it would be very difficult for this balance to be broken in the short term. However, Alex's appearance was like a sharp sword that mercilessly tore apart this pretense of peace. With his immense power and status in the hearts of the Roth Empire's citizens, his choice would undoubtedly break this delicate balance, and even King Edward couldn't ignore his opinion. Regardless of whether Alex had anything to do with the incident 3 years ago, most people didn't think that he would choose Josh after his return. Sean, who had once fought alongside him on the border, was clearly a better choice. After news of Alex's death spread, the first prince had personally stood in front of his coffin for 3 days and 3 nights, which was a clear indication of the deep friendship between the two of them. All of the officials who had already made their choice began to consider whether they had made the wrong decision, and the fence-sitters seemed to have found a clear direction to take, and were beginning to stir. The heavy downpour the night before was destined to shake the entire Roth Empire. Of course, there were some people who weren't affected by this, such as the normal citizens on the streets who were still debating what to eat for breakfast, or the high-spirited scholars who were making their way to Carlow Church. Carlow Church was located in the western part of Rodu. Black railings surrounded an extremely wide plot of land, and at the center of the yellowing lawn was a grand, domed church. 2 rows of large white stone pillars were arranged in an orderly fashion, and on the white flagstone plaza, white pigeons were searching for grass seeds between the cracks in the stone. A black-robed preacher wore a serious expression as he walked through the corridors of the church. Instead of a smile, he seemed to be in a hurry. The history of the church was even longer than that of the Roth Empire. During the War Among Species, the preachers roamed the Norland continent, healing those who had been injured during the war, and raising and protecting those children who had lost their parents during the war. They were deeply revered and worshipped by the humans. During the War Among Species, the church was one of the leaders of the human side. They were the ones who had gradually united the humans, and used the church as an organization to nurture many knights and magic casters for the human race. The Roth Empire to be the royal family, and the royal family to lead to the humans to the war. However, after the Roth Empire was established, the successive kings had been intentionally or unintentionally weakening the church's influence and control over the royal family. This was especially evident during the past few decades that Andrei had been in power. Carlow Church was the only church left in the Roth Empire, and most of the church's influence had been absorbed by the Magus Tower. All of the people who had survived the war had already died, and aside from some believers, this century-old church was now more like a symbol of the church's existence in human history. Even though the Pope was still nominally respected by the empire's royal family, there were extremely strict restrictions on preaching, so the church had essentially become a mere figurehead. The empty Carlo church had even become a venue for some of the ministers to hold large-scale events. For example, this debate was being held in Carlo church. The elderly preacher naturally didn't have to attend to such matters, so he stayed in the room at the back of the church. Even though the church was on the decline, it couldn't be bullied by just anyone. The Roth Empire's Ministry of Education had only borrowed the church's main hall, and couldn't access the rest of the church as they pleased. The young preacher served tea to these white-robed scholars with a serious expression before standing off to the side with his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't want these people to disturb the peace of the church, but he had no choice but to serve them, so his expression naturally wasn't very pleasant. The entire hall was paved with glossy golden marble, and light shone through the amber crystal dome, illuminating the entire hall. There were intricate murals carved onto the stone walls, most of which depicted how the church had saved the human race during the war among species. During that war-torn era, it was these preachers who had led the human race out of the Dark Age and established a true foothold on the Norland continent. Beneath these murals were hundreds of people in white and green robes sitting with their legs crossed. Some of them already had white hair, while others were still in their prime. There were clearly fewer people in green robes, and they were even younger. On the platform, there were 10 people sitting with their legs crossed, and half of them were in green robes while the other half was in white robes. All of the people in white robes were elderly men with white hair. In contrast, aside from Byron, who was sitting at the very center, the other 4 people in green robes were only middle-aged, and there was a young man who appeared to be around 30 years of age. All of the people in green robes wore nervous expressions as they turned to look at Byron from time to time. This was the last of the 10 debates, and the outcome of this debate would determine whether the Roth Empire would adopt the new system of arithmetic or continue to use the old hexadecimal system. Judging from the previous 9 matches, even though more and more factions were joining the Tsing-Yi faction, the Tsing-Yi reformists were still on the decline compared to the stubborn conservative faction. Furthermore, it was very difficult for the Tsing-Yi faction to launch a powerful counterattack to break through the Tsing-Yi faction's defense after the Tsing-Yi faction accused them of being traditional and inherited. If they were to lose this debate, then all of their efforts during this period would go to waste. Furthermore, the multiplication table that had given them hope of popularizing arithmetic would also go to waste, and that was something that no one wanted to see happen. Master Byron, it's already 9 a.m., let's begin the debate. A middle-aged man in a black robe stepped forward as he looked at Byron. Why aren't Mr. Meg and the others here yet? Luna was standing at the entrance of the hall, and she was looking toward the entrance of the church with an anxious expression. Byron also took a glance at the entrance before withdrawing his gaze as he nodded, and said, "Let's begin." "Father, should we have noodles or rice for breakfast?" Chapter 792. As soon as the time was up, the debate began. This debate, which had been going on for 2 months, had started off with daggers drawn and bows drawn. Soon, it entered a white-hot state. The hexadecimal system is a precious legacy left to us by our ancestors. It is the culmination of the wisdom of our ancestors, and it has played an extremely important role in our history for thousands of years. It has even affected the reproduction and survival of the human race. As such, countless mathematicians have worked tirelessly to develop and expand this field of study, thereby allowing it to reach its current height. This is the brightest star in the history of the human race. It is the result of the combined efforts of all of the greatest mathematicians in human history, and it will continue to guide the human race forward. However, all of you are now trying to replace it with a low-level algorithm, thereby giving up all of the work of your ancestors. What a foolish act. Elmo was sitting in the center of the conservative faction, and he had a large black mole on his glabella as he appraised Byron and the others with a sense of superiority in his voice. The conservative faction nodded in unison, and all of them were looking at the reformists with disdain in their eyes. They didn't know why these guys were following Byron's lead. They were trying to reform the hexadecimal system, and they were even making such a big fuss about it. The decimal system was only used for currency in the Roth Empire, and the mathematics world had always scoffed at it. They felt that such a crude algorithm was beneath them to be studied. If it weren't for the fact that currency was widely used on the entire Norland continent, the decimal system wouldn't have been introduced in the Roth Empire. Byron was the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Education, and he held the highest status among all of the people present. However, even with his status, it was still very difficult for him to implement the decimal system. This was a clear indication of just how deeply rooted the hexadecimal system was in the mathematics world of the Roth Empire. This incident had become the laughing stock of the entire academic community in the Roth Empire. Master Byron was a highly respected figure in the academic community, and he was nearing retirement age. If he were to do something like this, he would most likely become the laughingstock of the entire academic community. The decimal system is far more concise and efficient than the hexadecimal system. Combined with the Mamie multiplication table, the calculation efficiency will be increased by countless times. This is undoubtedly an advantage that the hexadecimal system has over the hexadecimal system. If we can replace the hexadecimal system with the decimal system, and popularize the Mamie multiplication table, we'll be able to greatly increase the intelligence of the populace. We'll be able to popularize arithmetic, and even allow all commoners to learn arithmetic. Liszt, the youngest scholar of the reformists, said with excitement. A blueprint seemed to have been unfolded in front of him. Commoners. Ha! Roy, who was sitting beside Irma, pursed his lips in disdain. Do you think those lowly and foolish commoners have the right to learn something as noble as arithmetic? Mathematics is a noble art exclusive to the nobles. What we should do is to let those ignorant people continue to be stupid. Who allowed you to raise the intelligence of the people? The more those ignorant commoners know, the more ideas they'll have, and that's not a good thing. Liszt's expression changed slightly as he slowly clenched his fists. He was born in a fallen noble family, and had entered the Bohemia Academy with outstanding results. With his astonishing aptitude in arithmetic, he had already become a professor at the Bohemia Academy at the age of 30, and was the youngest professor in the Bohemia Academy. When he was very young, his gambling addict grandfather had lost his entire manor. As such, he had lived with his father and mother in a normal residential area in the northern part of Rodu, living a life that was no different from that of a normal commoner. He had many playmates among the commoners. As such, in his heart, commoners were no better than his enemies. However, the noble system restricted their development, and they were unable to enter a noble school. Just as Roy had said, the education system in the Roth Empire could only be described as the education for the ignorant. The nobles received the best education to become more outstanding elites, while the commoners had no right to receive an education. They lived in ignorance for generations. Liszt was also aware that the commoners had to work hard to fill their stomachs every day, so they didn't have any extra money or spare time to receive an education. However, if the decimal system could replace the hexadecimal system, and the Mamie multiplication table could be popularized, then even the commoners would be able to quickly master all arithmetic up to 10. That would be enough for them to use in their daily lives. Quantitative change was bound to bring about qualitative change. Once enough commoners mastered the decimal system, it would definitely be a significant boost for the entire human race. Mathematics wasn't an art that only a minority of people pretended to be elegant. It was a tool that should be used in daily life and production. However, he just couldn't convince these esteemed masters of the Roth Empire to do so. Byron looked at Roy, and said in a serious voice, "The education system we're doing isn't education for the ignorant commoners. The nobles' education system has been popular for many years. What we're going to do next is to select some talented children from the commoners and educate them so that they can become pillars of the Roth Empire. Commoners have the blood of fools flowing through their veins. Even if we give them an opportunity to learn, they still won't be able to become pillars of the Roth Empire. Our Mathematics Association has already voted yesterday, and over 90% of our members are against the decimal system reform. They want to preserve the hexadecimal system, and that's the attitude and determination of the entire mathematics community. On top of that, this so-called multiplication table proposed by a nobody that hasn't even been tested and verified yet dares to challenge the hexadecimal system that we've been adhering to for thousands of years. If we were to change it, wouldn't we become the laughingstock of the entire continent? If the Roth Empire's mathematics heritage were to be destroyed, would you be able to bear the responsibility? Elton chuckled coldly as he glowered at the reformists. The reformist party fell silent as everyone turned to look at Byron. Only Lord Byron had the right to bear such a heavy burden. Even he most likely wouldn't be able to bear such a heavy burden. Luna was standing at the entrance of the palace with her hands clasped together as she looked at Byron with an anxious expression. This was a trap that Elton had set up, but regardless of whether Byron jumped into it or not, he was destined to lose. Smiles appeared on the faces of Irma and the others, as if they had already foreseen this outcome. Sorry, I'm late. Right at this moment, the door of the palace was suddenly pushed open from the outside. Chapter 793. The debate had already reached the climax, and no one dared to answer Olton's sharp questions. If the revolutionaries couldn't come up with a response, then the conservative faction would emerge victorious. However, right at this moment, someone suddenly barged into the venue. Everyone turned to look at the strange duo at the entrance. The short-haired young man and the half-elf girl didn't seem to have anything to do with this debate, so they were even more perplexed as to why they were here. Who is he? Olton glowered at Meg with a cold expression. If he could end this debate with a single sentence, then his reputation in the academic world would definitely skyrocket. As such, he was naturally not in a good mood to be interrupted at such a crucial moment. Is he the chef from the royal banquet yesterday? Irma faltered slightly at the sight of the father and daughter duo standing at the entrance. He had also attended the royal banquet the day before, so he naturally still remembered this pair of father and daughter. However, he didn't think that he would see them here again. Could it be that the debate was going to provide free meals? Did they invite him here to cook for them? That's right. Why is he here instead of cooking for His Majesty? Roy looked at Meg with furrowed brows. The revolutionaries were also quite perplexed as they didn't know who this intruder was. Teacher Luna. Amy hugged Ugly Duckling a little tighter as she greeted Luna with a smile. Amy, Mr. Meg. A faint smile appeared on Luna's nervous face. Even though he was a little late, Meg had still arrived, and the debate wasn't over yet. My apologies, I was delayed on the way here. Meg nodded in an apologetic manner. He wasn't the one who had made the breakfast, so it was a little difficult for him to choose. He had always been a punctual person. Mr. Meg, this way please. Byron rose to his feet with a smile on his face. All right. Meg gestured for Amy to stand beside Luna while he made his way over to Byron. Eldon said unhappily, Lord Byron, what do you mean? The head-to-head battle was still in progress, so how could they allow irrelevant people to interrupt? What's more, he's a chef who doesn't even know how to count. Do you want a chef to come on stage and debate for you? The people from the conservative faction burst into laughter. They looked at Meg with disdain. How could a chef know how to count? Then wouldn't they be the same as chefs? Not only is Mr. Meg the chef who won the Best Dish Award, but he's also the one who came up with the Mamie multiplication table. It's exactly because of his exceptional research that it's so easy to popularize arithmetic, and that's why this debate is taking place. Byron looked at Mag with a hint of approval in his eyes as he said, "How can you say that he has nothing to do with this? Among the people present, who was more qualified than him to sit here? Today, he is our sixth debater. When that damn sense of superiority disappears, it's going to be very uncomfortable, right?" The conservatives' faces all changed. Meg's words were like knives. Every sentence was so sharp that it made people feel uncomfortable. Change was a disturbing thing. Those new things made people feel unfamiliar and vigilant. Therefore, they were more willing to continue to stay in this familiar safe zone. No matter how good the new things were, as long as they stayed in the safe zone, they could continue to maintain their current state and stand in a position where people looked up to them. The eyes of the reformists lit up. During this period of time, they had been pushed to the ground by the other party. Moreover, the other party was a leading figure in the academic world, so they were even more cautious when speaking. Unlike Meg, who was as sharp as a knife, they couldn't help but want to cheer. Alton pointed at Meg and said angrily, You're talking nonsense. Mathematics is not child's play. If a 3-year-old child can calculate 2-digit multiplication, I'll stop writing today and go home. However, if you're talking nonsense, then you should tell the world that your so-called multiplication table is nothing but nonsense. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.